to see you. Good to see you. Can you see me okay? Hear me okay? Thumbs up? Good. Got a weird Zoom thing happening right now. It's bringing up the share window. I keep closing it and it keeps coming back. There it is again. I don't think it affects anything. Okay. We did a good bit of review last night on the License Law and Commission Rule. So we're going to launch right on into Landlord and Tenant tonight. Landlord Tenant and property management sort of go hand in hand. They're back to back. Syllabus 15 and 16. So that's what's coming up. Yeah, that'll take most of the night. Whatever we don't finish, or if we do finish a little early, we'll move on into fair housing. And then by next Wednesday, we'll probably have all of our official content covered. So then it'll be just a matter of review. So be ready. Make sure that you bring your questions. From here forward, go back through the practice exams. After next Wednesday, we'll turn you loose to take the practice exam final, state and national. So that'll be 1, 2, 3. That'll be 3 on schedule. Good full nights of review. So going strong. Okay. So landlord and tenant, we talked about freehold estates once upon a time, weeks and weeks ago. That was ownership. And we made a brief mention about the opposite of ownership, which is renting, and that's called non-freehold estates or leasehold estates. So we'll be talking about the 4 kinds of leasehold estates. There's only 4. Remember, in the freehold estates, ownership was like, what? I think 5. Defeasible had 2 within itself. And then, so there was fee simple absolute, fee simple defeasible, estate for the life of another, conventional life estate, and then a marital life estate. But that's all for ownership. Now we're going to be talking about when you're renting from that owner. So we'll look at the characteristics of those different types. We'll talk about the purposes and some essential and common lease provisions. What I'm going to suggest to you, as you put your names in the chat, is that you relate the lease to something else we've studied. When you're thinking about the lease, who is that between? Who's the lease between? The tenant and the owner, right? Or the landlord. So that's a contract, right? Just like a sales contract is a contract. So while the lease is between the tenant and the owner, the contract is between the buyer and the owner or seller. So just relate the lease to the contract, and there's a lot of similarities. A couple little differences, and we'll point those out. And then on the other chapter after this one about property management, that's where we're going to be focusing on the relationship between an owner of a rental property and the person they hire to manage it for them. They don't always do that. And I bet most people who venture into that field try to manage their own rental property for a while, at least for a bit, until it gets ugly, until they have to evict someone, or until a toilet blows up at 3 a.m. and they have to get out of bed and go fix an emergency. Then they start seeing maybe the value in paying someone else to handle those sorts of things. Or maybe they never do. But that property management agreement is between the owner of the property and the broker who they're hiring to manage it for them if they choose to. Just like what document? What's another document we've already studied that's between an owner of a property and a broker? Yeah, the listing agreement, you bet. So relate that property management agreement in relationship to that whole listing relationship and the listing agreement. So just think about that up front. We're going to cover the landlord tenant first. So we'll be thinking about how the sales contract relates to the lease contract. And we'll point those things out as we go. Our objectives are to include these pieces of legislation, these acts. There's a North Carolina Residential Rental Agreements Act. That's what dictates how the parties must behave, the tenant and the landlord. There's a Vacation Rental Act, which dictates how to handle something that's a short-term vacation rental. There's some differences there. What's the biggest difference between a regular lease and a vacation rental lease? The duration. So do you think on a vacation rental, sometimes someone maybe occasionally misbehaves and has to get evicted? Sure. Do you think they get to take 30, 60, 90 days to get evicted like they do on a regular lease? No, there's no time for that. It's all faster. The eviction process is in a matter of days instead of weeks and months when it's a vacation rental. And that Vacation Rental Act kind of points out those various things. We don't get too deep into it, but that's what it's about. We're going to look at the rights of tenants when they're living in public housing and the rights under fair housing laws as well. Fair housing violations are pretty common when it comes to property management and rentals, probably more so than sales. People who own their property violating the rights of others based on protected classes. Well, I think the logic there is, or the reason at least, is not logical, but in a sale, the worst, most prejudiced person may sell to anybody, even though they don't like everybody, because they're going to be finished with it. They're leaving. They just want their money. On a lease, on a rental, they're still the owner, and so those nasty habits are going to come out probably a little more prevalently. So we see that fair housing violation stuff in rentals a little more, I think, because of that reason. And we'll talk about it. And then we'll look at the major provisions in the standard form provided by the North Carolina Association of Realtors, the standard lease form. Standard lease form. We do have one available to us as brokers. So we'll take a look at that, and not too deeply, but we'll relate it to what a contract for sale looks like. So a lease, what is a lease? A lease is bilateral. So is a contract for sale. They're both promises made from both parties. So the lease includes promises from an owner/landlord and promises from a tenant. And the lease also, big difference between that and the contract. The lease says, yes, you get to use it, but it doesn't say you are the owner and you get to do all the things owners do. The lease pretty much says you get to live there. Or if it's a commercial lease, you get to work out of there. But you don't have any other rights that owners would have, including you can't sell it. You might be able to sublease it. Sometimes there's a sublease arrangement in a lease where if you're finished with it, if you need to leave before your lease expires, they might let you, if you can find another person, sublet it out to them. There is sort of a version of that subleasing that's been going on the last few years. And what am I thinking about? Where you might sign a lease, particularly for like a vacation property, but for a longer term. There you go, Marcus, you nailed it. There have been people who've been kind of Airbnb hacking. And what I always thought about when 2020 rolled around and that whole freeze on evictions happened, there were people that signed multiple year-long leases on quirky or interesting or attractive or location destination kind of properties, lakefront, oceanfront, and they just wanted to put a series of Airbnb clients every weekend. And I think sometimes owners actually got a hold of that and got wind of it and figured out, are they going to make sure that they clean up after each one of these? Are they going to handle it right while it was still sort of not well known? And then owners couldn't evict there for a while, and it got a little crazy. And some of these highly leveraged lease hackers, people who were signing long leases so that they could hopefully get Airbnb tenants and then couldn't put them in there, and they had to pay the leases. I'm sure it got kind of ugly. So when we have a rental property, there's two kinds of estates going on at one time. The freehold kind, whatever that owner owns it as, maybe fee simple absolute, hopefully, because that's the best way, and simultaneously the kind of estate that they have entered into with their tenant, a non-freehold or a leasehold estate, giving that tenant the right to use it. So that leasehold possession is not lifetime, and it's not ownership, and it's one of these four. These are the four kinds of non-freehold or leasehold estates. I want to start backwards. I want to start with the bottom one, the one called estates at sufferance, an estate at sufferance. So let's start with that one. Let me flip ahead here because it's short and sweet. Not so sweet. We're not happy about it. Estate at sufferance is an unfriendly situation. It's because the tenant is beyond their welcome. They've stayed past their welcome. They need to leave. They are illegally occupying the property because their expiration or termination of their lease termination date has come and gone. And so they were originally there legally, but now they're not. They didn't move out at the end of the lease period. They've stopped paying their rent. And so this is now called an estate at sufferance. And they are referred to as a holdover tenant. A holdover tenant is someone in an estate at sufferance situation. And that's about it. All you need to know about this is it's not happy, not friendly. They're there illegally. Now, there's another one that's pretty low-key, pretty informal, but this one is happy. This is a friendly version. This is nobody breaking any rules or laws. This is an informal agreement that's still a lease. It's called an estate at will. Think of it this way, at the will of the parties, right? So the landlord is saying to the tenant, look, yeah, go ahead. You can rent it from me, but I might want you to move out any given moment. I might need you to leave without very much notice, if at all. And the tenant would say back to them, okay, that's fine, because I might want to leave without notice to you. So either one can call it to the other one. It might be something that happens like if the landlord owner has the house for sale. The property's for sale, but they don't want it to sit there empty. And so they're going to let their cousin rent it as an estate at will for a minute, an indeterminate time. At any moment, they might say to this tenant, look, okay, we got a contract on it. You're going to need to be out by next week or next month or whatever. So it's informal between landlord and tenant. Either one can terminate without notice, and neither one are going to be mad about it. Well, they might be, but they have no legal right to be because it was an estate at will. It wasn't your traditional leasehold kind of arrangement. And that's the gist of it. That's pretty much those two. Estate at sufferance, not happy, illegal, holdover tenant, somebody's staying past their welcome and not paying rent. And estate at will is this one, casual, informal. Either party can terminate without notice and they're not going to be mad about it. Then we get to the typical ones that you're familiar with. And so we've covered those last two. Now we're going to talk about the top one called an estate for years, or an estate from year to year. And here's one of those annoying real estate pre-licensing issues that I have to share with you. One of those things that makes no sense for the purpose of remembering it. In fact, I guess the one best way you can remember this is that it is the opposite of what makes sense. It's called an estate from year to year or an estate for years, but years have really nothing to do with it. It's for any amount of time. Just replace the word years with some amount of time. It could be days, weeks, months. Just remember it. That's all I can tell you. Years has nothing to do with the fact that it's years. It's not necessarily years. It's any amount of time, any period of time. And I hate that I even use the word period of time there, because the next one we're going to talk about is this one that does have the word period. Okay, so I'm going to change this slide back here. This one, any amount of time would be a better word for me to use for this slide. So we've got an estate for years. Back to this slide, an estate for years up at the top, also known as an estate from year to year. And then the next one we're going to talk about after that is a periodic tenancy or a period to period estate. I know. Best thing I could say is make a chart after we go through them. So let's finish this. An estate from year to year. Here's what it looks like. It's for any amount of time, regardless of that word in the title. It must have a definite beginning and a definite ending date in the lease. You got to write it in the lease that this is when it starts and this is when it ends. And then it terminates with no required notice. And if you think about the logic there, you did give notice back when you signed the lease and saw that the end date was going to be spelled out. They said, here's when we're starting this and here's what it ends. So that's sort of the notice. That is it. That's when it ends. But if you terminate it, you don't have to give notice earlier than that. You might have penalties for trying to get out of it early, but it terminates with no notice because you put in the lease. This is when this lease is over. And then there's also no automatic renewing of the lease. Doesn't just keep on going automatically. You would have to acknowledge it and say, yeah, okay, let's keep this up. Let's renew the lease. It's not going to renew automatically. That is an estate for years. That's pretty much it that you need to know about an estate for years. Let's look at the next one, the last of the four. An estate from period to period starts with a defined initial duration. Here's the initial period. It might be like a year, for instance. Let's do this for a year. It does require termination notice. If you want to end it, you got to say so. Because if you don't give notice, it's going to keep on going perpetually. So no defined end date. You'd have to give notice to end it. That's the big difference between this one and that last one. With this one, automatic renewal. You got to give notice if you want to end it. With the last one, no automatic renewal. It's going to end when it's spelled out to end in the lease. No notice given. I'll let you screenshot it if you haven't already. Give you a second to do that, and then I'll show you the next one. And then there's period to period. Let me know if I go too quick. Now, when we're talking about notice to terminate, under the law, you've got to have a certain minimum amount of that notice. Can't just give any old amount of notice. So if what you have signed is a week-to-week lease, then you have to at least give them 2 days notice to terminate that periodic tenancy. Week-to-week lease requires at least 2 days. A month-to-month lease requires at least 7 days. And a year-to-year lease requires at least 30 days notice. So that's the other thing. Got to give notice for termination. So the amount of notice that you have to give depends on the length of the lease. Do you notice that? Something else depends on the length of the lease that we'll cover in a little while. And that's going to be the security deposit. How much is required depends on how long the lease is going to be. And I'm sure those of you who are renters or have been renters, you remember that. You know that they charge you a certain amount of security deposit, and they probably charged you more for a year lease versus a 6-month or a month to month. So both of these things, amount of notice for termination and amount of security deposit, depends on how long the lease is for. There are some different characteristics of some certain lease types. And think about it this way too. We're not always talking about a residential lease. In real estate, on the commercial side, they deal with leases a lot. I've rarely dealt with leases because I've mostly done residential. But when you do commercial, you might do leases and sales all in the same transaction because you're helping somebody buy one, and then you're also helping them find a tenant to put in there. You may not be the property manager who maintains it every month, but you could be someone who helps them find a tenant, at least initially. So keep that in mind. We're not only talking about residential types of leases. We're going to cover these 4. First of all, a fixed lease means that what the tenant is paying is just the rent. The landlord is covering the expenses. Landlord pays expenses when it's a fixed lease. Tenant covers rent only. If it's something called a percentage lease, now this is something we run into with commercial. Think about a hair salon. They're renting space in a strip mall, okay? And so she's paying that for that space, and it could be anything. It could be the smoothie store. It could be the jewelry store. But they're paying their rent amount based either completely or partially on how much they make in a given month. So that might be attractive to somebody who's just starting the business. In the first few months, they might not make that much, so they wouldn't have to pay as much. It's not like a fixed hard cost. It's going to depend on how your sales are going. But then as your sales increase, your rent is going to go up because it's based, at least in part, on your income. So the tenant's paying a portion of the rent based on their income. It might look like something like this. There we go. So test question might show something like this. The tenant has a percentage lease. It includes, or they must pay, a base, because sometimes it might include a base rent of $1,000 per month, plus $10% of profits in that given month over a certain amount, over like $10,000. How much would their rent be in a month where they have sales of $13,000? That's weird grammar, but I hope you get the point. So what are we going to do? We're going to say, all right, well, the base rent that doesn't change is $1,000 a month. So we know they're going to have to pay $1,000. And then they're going to have to pay 10% of whatever they make over 10,000. Well, they made 13,000 in this given month. That's 3,000 more than 10. And so that 3,000 times 10% is going to need to be added to this base rent. So 3,000 times 10%, another $300. So their total rent for that month would be $1,300. They might make you do those acrobatics. I've seen that on some test questions, some practice questions. So it might be that the whole rent is based on this percentage, but it could be that it includes a base amount plus this percentage amount. So we're talking about a percentage lease with that. And I mean, it could have been that it's 10% of whatever the profit is. Forget the 10,000. If that's the case, that's terrible. 13,000 times 10%, it would have been another 1,300 plus that 1,000. So in that case, it would have been a total of $2,300. But that's the idea. You're going to need to know that type of lease, a percentage lease, is about the profit or income based on profit. And then the other kind of lease that they like to test on is called a net lease. A net lease is not based on profit. A net lease is based on what? When you think of net lease, think about net operating income. What did you have to get? What did you have to do in order to arrive at the figure for net operating income? You had to subtract out for operating expenses, right? And so that's what a net lease is about. It's based on expenses. So percentage lease is based on income or profit. A net lease is based on the expenses. The tenant's going to pay some of the expenses. Maybe all of them. So that's the next one here. Tenant pays a portion of the expenses. Brings us to another acronym that you might have run across in your reading or you might have heard about. But the acronym is TICAM, TICAM. Anybody know what those letters mean? What are the letters in TICAM talking about? Any idea? The T and the I are something we've seen before. There you go. Just like the pity payment, taxes and insurance. So TICAM includes taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. Common area maintenance. Think about like an office building. You go in, there's a lobby that has to be maintained. There's the elevators, there's the restrooms, maybe a break room, snack room, vending machines, and then, of course, the grounds out front, the sidewalks, the parking lot. So the common area that's shared by all of the tenants in the building, all of those commercial tenants, that's what we're talking about. Taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance is what TICAM means. And so with a net lease, the tenant is paying all or a portion of those expenses. If it's I used to teach this class in person, like live in a physical room, and I would teach out of the Huntersville location of a real estate firm in their conference room. And they were in a 4-story office park in Huntersville off exit 23. If you go on to the left at the top of the ramp, and you'll see this little really nice ones. They're glass front, pretty recent, pretty new. And I can't even think of how many businesses might have been in there. There was I think an Aveda Institute, like a school. There was some sort of a medical business. And so all of those tenants, if they had net leases, they all shared the TICAM together, probably based on their square footage. The real estate brokerage I worked in the conference room out of, they had a pretty big size space, but not all of those tenants in that building had the same size space, of course. So they would probably have multiplied it out and said, okay, you've got 20,000 square feet. then that's this percentage of the total building square feet, then you're going to pay that same percentage of the TICAM. So they would likely spread it out that way, so as to be fair between the various tenants. So that's what a net lease would be referring to. Just remember that a percentage lease is the tenant paying based upon income or profit, and a net lease is the tenant's lease or rent amount being based on them having to pay some expenses. What about that case again where we've got a tenant, maybe a new business? They're just starting their new place, and so they're worried about being able to afford the rent. And so that brings up this idea of a graduated lease. Graduated lease means you're going to start lower and it's going to go up in graduated intervals, predetermined intervals throughout the lease. Maybe for the whole first year, you get to pay $1,000 less than the market rent. Then the second year, you get to pay another $500 on top of that. And then the third year and beyond, you pay the full market rent and you're subject to whatever increases because, every year they like to increase that rent, don't they? So that's the idea. You're starting lower, working your way up. Some other kinds of leases that exist out there in the world. This is an unusual one. We don't see this a lot. I think they do it in other countries more often than they do here. But the tenant is renting the dirt, the ground itself. The ground lease is when they rent the ground, but they buy and pay for and build their own building on it. So the tenant is an owner of the structure that they've built upon it, but they're renting the dirt, probably for a longer term. I wouldn't want to rent that ground for like a year and then put 6-7 figure building on top of it. But that's what a ground lease is. It could be renting the land, building your own building. In the case of mineral oil and gas rights, we talked about that a little bit. Once upon a time, that would potentially involve a ground lease. And instead of you selling them your land, you just lease it to them being like the oil company. If you go down through Texas, you'll see farmhouses, and out in the back field, there's one of those oil rigs kind of churning up that oil from out of the ground. And so they probably they didn't just sell the land to the oil company, they just signed a ground lease to them. And that oil company came in, and that big structure that's doing that pumping, that still belongs to the oil company. That's their device. They might even have structures or buildings that they build on it, but they're renting the ground itself. A full service lease is when the tenants are sharing that common area expense together. And then there's our oil and mineral rights lease that we just talked about. So you could own land and then rent to someone to dig for minerals under your land, subsurface rights. That's it. That's pretty much the types of leases. So ground, full service, oil and mineral, and then fixed, percentage, net, and graduated. So let's dig into that lease a little more. And again, now let's think about how it relates to a contract for sale. Essential provisions of a valid lease. Oh, well, that's the trick, Holly. So she says in a subsurface lease, who owns the oil and gas that comes out? That's why they're renting it. It would be the tenant. The tenant who has that ground lease is the one, they're renting it, therefore they get whatever comes out of the ground. So that owner would need to be happy with how much they're being paid for that rent in light of how much that stuff might be worth. Otherwise, what's their other options? Rather than rent it to someone else, they could maybe get into the business themselves, partner with somebody who has the equipment needed to pull those resources up out of the ground. But a quicker, easier way to make money is to say, yeah, you get whatever you can get up out of there, and I'll charge you this rent. Good point. So with a valid lease, it looks a lot like, that's a good question. She says, in the fracking companies, do they own or lease their land? I don't know. Probably a little bit of both. Probably whatever they can work out. with the owner. I know that D.R. Horton Home Builder, I think I mentioned them before. They are dealing with it in Florida now, but they dealt with a situation in North Carolina where they were selling new construction homes and reserving the right to sell or maybe rent. I think it was sell the subsurface rights underneath. So they got two chunks of money. They sold the surface rights to somebody to live in the house, and they sold the subsurface rights to someone else to dig or drill for minerals underneath. That didn't go over so well. They had to stop doing that. And I think they're dealing with the same kind of headache in Florida now, interestingly. They'd probably rather own, although I guess it's going to depend on their financial statements and their plan. They might rather rent. They might rather just lease it. Because once they've pulled up all the resources, how valuable is it to them anymore? Might be more valuable to them just to pay for the rent, get what they want out of it, and then move on to something else and lease the next one and pull those resources out of that ground. So a valid lease, think about a valid contract for sale. Do we have mutual agreement? Sure. The parties need to say, yep, this is what we want to do. I want to sell to you, or in this case, I want to lease from you or lease to you. We have to have consideration. What's the consideration on a contract for sale? The purchase price. That's the consideration. What's the consideration in a lease? What is that thing called consideration when we're talking about a lease? Yeah, it's the rent. Yeah, that's why that landlord's doing it, or owner. And then the capacity to contract. If we see the word capacity, what does that make us think? What three things are we thinking about? Someone has the capacity to enter into a contract. Are they what, or what? That again. Yeah. 18, sane and sober. Same thing. Same thing as the purchase. And then it must be for a legal objective in order to be considered a valid lease. And you know what I'm going to say. Anybody watch Ozark? Anybody watch the show Ozark? It involves this guy who gets in trouble with the mob, and he goes to the Ozarks, and he meets this lady who's lived there forever, and she grows poppy and sells it to make, I guess, what do you make out of that? Heroin or something? And so I'm thinking of those poppy fields, right? If she were to lease the poppy fields to someone else to grow the heroin producing, there you go, Marcus, herbs or whatever you call them, then that would not be a legal objective, and that would therefore not be a valid lease. It would be a lease that Judge Judy would throw out of court. So same idea as the purchase. Must be for a legal objective in order to be a valid lease. So that's how you can remember it. Just relate it to a contract for sale. Very similar. Besides these four things, these are the things that make it a valid lease. Remember, the word valid doesn't mean that this is allowed and all the other ones are not. Valid means who can walk away from it without repercussions, without consequences. So a valid lease means neither party can. Both parties have consequences to walking away and backing out of this legal document, legal contract called a lease. So what are some other things that might show up in a lease? If you were going to rent out your property, say you own a property and you want to rent it to someone else, what sort of stuff do you want to make sure is covered in the lease? There you go. Who's going to cover utilities? That's a big one for sure. What if it is a Marty Bird situation? That's the main character in that Ozark, and his colleague, that crazy lady that grew the poppy. Do you want to make sure you know what they're going to rent from you to do with the property? What's their plan? What are they doing with it? Yeah. They're going to list out, here's why you're leasing from me. You don't just have free use of it, because then you could end up opening yourself up for being like an accomplice. So you've got to state in the lease, this is for this purpose, residential. You're renting from me to live there. And that might even come down to, they want to make sure that you're not operating a business out of it, a legal business, but still they don't want you to operate a business if it's going to mean maybe a hair salon out of your home, and the neighborhood rules, the HOA rules prohibit a bunch of cars being parked all the time in and out so much. That would be probably a problem for a lot of those neighborhoods. So yeah, spelling out what you're not allowed to do, what the tenant is allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, the use of their property. Does it create toxic chemicals? Are there environmental concerns? Are they going to try to dump things out into the woods behind the property, which would then ultimately affect the owner themselves? Maybe that tenant rented there for a year and they, in the middle of the night, dumped their 55-gallon barrels full of paint chemicals, and then they're gone. The lease is over, that tenant's gone, and then it comes out. It's discovered. And now who gets to clean that up? The owner is always responsible, because the previous owner who might have done it, the new owner may not have had anything to do with it. But if they're the only one that can be reached, they're the ones going to have to pay to clean it up. So yeah, they want to make sure that all that sort of stuff is covered. We talked about a certain kind of fixture back when we were dealing with fixtures. When it comes to a lease, there are trade fixtures. So what's going to happen to that equipment? If it's a bar and grill or just a grill, there's a little grill around the corner on a strip mall near my house. It makes really good burgers. They're at the end of the strip. There's a Food Lion. There's a pizza place at the other end. There's I think a nail salon and a Chinese restaurant. But then there's this burger and fry joint. And they have griddles and stoves and sinks, and all of that equipment probably belongs to them. Probably belongs to that tenant. So when they leave, because they're going to outgrow this place, for instance, then they're going to want to take that stuff with them. And they're going to be allowed to, because those things are trade fixtures. They're personal property. They're not real property. So that lease would spell out the deal with the trade fixtures, if any. Samantha, you're killing me with that little baby. That is precious. Am I seeing an ear? Oh my gosh. Congratulations. And then repairs. Repairs, what are we going to do? Especially for non-residential. What's the landlord responsible for versus the tenant? Might be some sort of a limit. Might be like up to this amount the tenant has to do. Beyond that amount, the landlord has to do. So all of that would need to be spelled out in the lease too. And then with commercial, this issue of upfitting comes up. So if it's the hair salon, do they have like a waiting room up front? And do they need it to have like a counter, a check-in counter, maybe some display shelves that are built in, a seating area, and then you go back past the counter and there's all the stations. So the landlord, in order to entice that tenant to rent from them, might say, look, I'll cover this. I'll cover your upfitting. What do you want it to use it for? A hair salon? Okay, well, I'll make that lobby for you. We'll build walls. We'll put in sinks. I helped a church, a little startup church, find a place to rent. I might have mentioned it before. And the place we found for them was previously a laundromat. And so when we went in there, it had this structure, this sort of check-in station mounted in the front. Besides that, it was wide open. All the equipment was gone. And so part of that was they I think rather than ask the landlord for upfits, they just got the landlord to reduce the rent a little bit, and they did the work to knock out all that stuff because it didn't serve any purpose for them. They needed to build a lot of walls though. And what they ended up building were they created the main sanctuary with 2 big walls, and they put in sound dampening insulation, and they made a big lobby area in the front. And then a raised sound booth to put in, the mixer for the speakers and all that fun stuff. And so when they move out, they're not going to tear down those walls. But the landlord might, because the next tenant may not need it laid out that same way. Odds are good that the next tenant's not going to want it to be that way at all. It's like I think it's probably a 70 or 80 foot by 80 foot square room. So the landlord might do some upfits to entice them to start the lease. And then it might turn out that when that lease is up, when it's commercial, it might be longer than a year, by the way. Might be more like 2 or 3 or 5 years or 10. Say it's like a 10-year lease. Well, 10 years of operating a business out of that space, it's going to get worn even more, even faster than probably a residence would. And then also the stuff that's in it, like if you think about what was in 10 years ago, what colors were in a kitchen? It was a lot of stainless steel. It was still some wood grain cabinets. White and gray were starting to be popular, but now that's all you see. I looked at 5 or 6 houses today. They're all white counter cabinets, either white or gray. Counters are either white or light gray. And the fixtures, the pulls, the drawer pulls, the cabinet pulls are gold. They were all bronzy or gold. Once upon a time, they would have been black or stainless. So the same thing for this. You put in what's hot now, and in 10 years, it's not. Now it looks dated. So the landlord might say, well, your lease is up. In order to sign and renew your lease here, instead of you going down the street to the next new, cool, sexy place that just got built, stay here with me, and I will pay to upfit and give you a renovation, give you sort of a makeover, make this place look new again. So those upfits could serve a purpose initially and then later when it comes time to renew. As to repairs, tenants are usually required to make the ordinary repairs. And if they don't make repairs, the landlord could hold them liable for wasting the property. They let it just go into disarray, right? So that's one main issue. The tenant's usually required to return the premises into the same condition when they got it, with allowance for ordinary use. So back to that church example, that landlord might require them to knock all that stuff down, take down those walls and turn it back into that wide open space that they got it as. But that would be spelled out in the lease, ideally. So here we are about the upfits again. The commercial landlord's probably going to provide and pay for the initial customization of upfits for that tenant. And then the tenant could say, well, I want you to do this and this and this, put the walls here and make it this color and paint it this color gray, not that color gray. The landlord could offer upfits again to renovate the space in order to retain the tenant, keep them from going somewhere else. Some other major provisions: can the tenant lease it out to someone else and sublet it? That's the word, to sublet. One of my most expensive mistakes in this business, I got mad. I left the second firm I was at because they didn't back me up on something, and I walked out. That wasn't the mistake. The mistake was I thought I needed space, like office space. And so I went around the corner in the same office complex and signed a 3-year lease for basically a little single office space, which was dumb because I never needed it. I could have met people at Starbucks or at the house, which is really what I always did anyway. And so I had a neighbor next door who was a CPA. His name was Satyapal Puri. And he would always say, as we would talk, I learned a lot from him. He'd say, it is what it is. But it got to the point in year 2 that I really didn't want to pay this rent anymore. And he needed more space. So I subleased mine to his. And he was able to take over my space, pay me. It was most of what I was paying, but not all of it. He slowed the bleeding. He didn't stop the bleeding. It's like $900 a month. And he covered, I think, $800 or $850. And so I still had to pay it out the rest of that term, but at least it got me out of there. So I was able had to check with the landlord and say, can I sublease to him? Or better yet, will you let me out of my lease? And they said, no, we're not going to let you out of your lease. But if you can find a tenant to take over, we'll let you sublease to them. And thankfully, my neighbor, Paul, did. I could have also possibly assigned the lease to someone else altogether. Other provisions are going to talk about how long does this lease go, what happens when it's over, does it automatically renew, how much do you renew for? Anybody ever stayed in a residential place and then your 12 months was up and you went to month, and it was a lot more, wasn't it, for month to month? That's a thing that happens that they like to do. Same kind of stuff with commercial. Those things can change, but need to be spelled out in the lease. What happens if the tenant stops paying? What is the process for default? If you stop paying your rent, here's what we're going to do. Here's how it's going to work. That would be spelled out in the lease as well, whether commercial or residential. There might also be those preemptive rights. Remember when we were talking about an option to purchase, and right after the option to purchase, we talked about that weird phrase, preemptive rights. So an option to purchase is when you don't rent or live there, you don't get to use it, but you sign an option agreement and you pay an option fee, and the owner has to wait and see what you want to do if you actually do want to buy it. Well, something related to an option to purchase are preemptive rights. There's something called a right of first opportunity to purchase, which means if the seller decides they want to sell, they'll let you have a shot at it first. You have that in writing, and they have to honor that, give you a chance. The other one is the right of first refusal. And that one is when the seller gets an offer from a third party. They can't just take it. They've got to check with you first. If you have this right of first refusal in writing, then you have first right to refuse. So those might be in place in the lease if that's something that the parties want to make available. The owner might say, no, I don't ever want to sell it. So no, we're not doing either of these things. But if they are open to the idea, they'll at least consider it. They would put that in there too. There's also the right of the landlord to make sure you're doing right. To pop in from time to time. They can't just pop in though. They have to give you notice. But the landlord's rights to come in, and the term covenant of quiet enjoyment comes to mind. That means that you get to live there without worrying about your mortgage company coming in unannounced. Well, the covenant of quiet enjoyment also applies to your landlord. For the most part, they can't just pop in suddenly. They do have the right to come in usually, but they would have to give you notice. And quite often I see like 24 hours notice. If I were a landlord, I would use this right, because something else we'll see in a little bit is that the landlord has to provide working smoke detectors, but it's officially the tenant's responsibility to maintain the batteries. I'll give you the batteries nice and fresh and a working smoke detector, but you got to keep it running. Well, guess what? That's still my property. I don't want you to forget to put the batteries in. And I would rather you not die from smoke inhalation. It's bad for business. It's bad for your life. And I'd feel terrible. So I would probably combine the two things. I would say, you know what? Don't worry about the batteries. I'm going to be coming in once a month. I'll give you notice. I'm going to come in and change the filters. That's the other thing that people don't do. Change the air filters in their heating and air system. And I bet a tenant always would forget, because they don't think in terms of ownership. They're there to use it and live in it. They don't need to think in terms of ownership. So that's how I would run it. I would come in, make sure they're not growing stuff in the bathroom, and I would change the filters, and I'd change the smoke detector batteries every 6 weeks or whatever, or every 6 months. But those provisions would need to be spelled out. Here's how the lease can terminate. Similar, again, to a contract. The parties could agree, hey, let's just not do this anymore. Mutually agree to terminate the lease. Or more typically, the term of the lease expires. It ends in a year, and that date is what you're always thinking about, and that's comes and goes, and it's done. It could terminate because of a bankruptcy, or the property gets condemned. The property's in really bad shape, operation of law. Or it could be somebody doesn't fulfill their end of the bargain. They breach the contract. They breach the lease. And so all of these various things are pretty much a mirror image of what we saw with the contract for sale. We also talked about the statute of frauds. And do you remember what the statute of frauds says? That and the Connor Act apply to some other things we've studied. The statute of frauds is the one that's about how it needs to be in writing. Something needs to be in writing in order to be what? Enforceable in a court of law. Must be in writing. If it's not in writing, Judge Judy kicks you out and says, I can't help you. I can't enforce something that was verbal, not ever in writing. Well, and it must be in writing in order to be enforceable. That includes, and this is going to take a little bit of extra brain power, that includes leases that are longer than 3 years. Not leases that are 3 years or less. Not 3-year leases. You with me? Write those things down because you can be tired on the exam. Read it real quick and they'll say, so-and-so signed a lease for 3 years. When the new owner took over, they kicked the tenant out. Was this allowed? Or something along those lines. And you're going to see the word 3 and you're going to just gloss right over it and answer it incorrectly. So it's leases that are longer than 3 years. If they're not in writing, then the tenant could get kicked out by the new owner. They don't have the same protections that they do when it's a lease that's 3 years or less. A tenant, commercially especially, does not have the same protections. If it's a 3-year lease or less than 3 year, then it's illegal for you to kick a tenant out if you buy a property. You got to honor the existing lease when you buy a property that has a lease in place. So if it's a lease for over 3 years, that's not the case. It would need to be in writing in order to protect that tenant from getting kicked out. So there's that little nuance about over or longer than 3-year leases. Must be in writing, must be signed by both parties, landlord and tenant. If it's a lease for more than 3 years in order to protect that tenant. If these things aren't in place, then that tenant is in jeopardy. They could face being evicted improperly, but it would be allowed because it wasn't in writing, it wasn't signed by the parties. The Connor Act says that leases longer than 3 years must be recorded as well. So if that lease that exceeds 3 years is not recorded, the property is sold. Again, new owner does not have to honor the lease. So as a recap, statute of frauds means something has to be in writing to be enforced. And Connor Act says something must be recorded to protect against third-party claims. When we come back from break, we'll talk about the Residential Rental Agreements Act. That's the thing that keeps landlords and tenants both, when it's residential, from misbehaving. I'll see you back in 10. Welcome back. Here we go. That's where we left off. All right, let's talk about how the parties have to treat each other. How do we take care of each other? Well, the landlord and the tenant both have responsibilities. First and foremost, within this Residential Rental Agreements Act, are we talking about commercial property? Is this the hair salon? Is this the Subway? Nope. It's residential. So we're talking about that situation where someone is renting a place in order to live in it. The Residential Rental Agreements Act says the property must be safe, habitable, able to be inhabited safely. Only habitable residential rental units are allowed to be rented. No, doesn't apply to transient residences like bed and breakfast, hotels, motels. Those don't fall under the Residential Rental Agreements Act. Vacation rentals, they don't fall under this. There's a Vacation Rental Act that handles them. They don't apply to commercial either. It requires that both landlord and tenant keep the property safe, clean, habitable. If they fail to fulfill these things, then the other party is not responsible for fulfilling their duties. If you breach your side, then they don't have to keep their side. And it mostly hinges around habitability. It's a lot of that. So the landlord, let's talk about what the landlord is required to do. Their duties statutorily under the Residential Rental Agreements Act are first and foremost to keep it safe, fit, habitable. They also have to comply with building code. They can't just build something without getting permits for it. It's got to comply with the building code. They can't do repairs without proper repairs being done and permits for those repairs. They've got to keep the common areas safe. If the elevator lobby has a wire that's still live, just hanging loose, obviously that would be a violation of the Residential Rental Agreements Act. They have to make repairs in a reasonably prompt time frame. And we've all heard stories of landlords not being in a particular hurry to make repairs. But a landlord who doesn't make repairs and maintain the property could be deemed negligent and could also be held liable for injuries that take place. And that applies to electricity, plumbing, appliances, heating and air. So the landlord's got to keep it safe and habitable, pretty much. The other thing that we talk about in this chapter is what happens when they don't. What happens when the parties misbehave? But before we get into that, let's compare the landlord's statutory duties with the tenant. Here's what the tenant's responsible for. Oh, look, same thing. Keep the premises fit and safe, fit and habitable. Tenant can't just be in there trashing it, letting it go into disarray. They've got to also keep the plumbing fixtures clean. Let's all take a moment to shudder at the thought of dirty plumbing fixtures. This means that people did this poorly. If it's in here, it's because it got real bad at some point, many times along the way. The tenant's not allowed to damage the property. The tenant must also comply with building codes. And here's a big one for the tenant that's a little different for the landlord. The tenant, it's spelled out in the Residential Rental Agreements Act that they must remove their trash. Makes me think of those shows about hoarding, right? So if you're renting a place and it's one of those hoarding situations where when you walk on the floor, it's 2 feet above the floor because of all the newspapers and magazines and trash, you're violating your lease because you're supposed to remove trash. And then the tenant is also responsible not for the basic wear and tear that's going to happen anywhere, like carpet getting worn, but for things that are beyond that. Damage that happens over and above normal wear and tear is the responsibility of the tenant. How's that tenant going to be held responsible for one of these types of things? An example of a thing that's beyond ordinary normal wear and tear is crayon marks on the wall. Crayon marks is over and above normal wear and tear. How are we going to handle that for the tenant if they move out and it's got marks all over the walls and huge holes in the carpet and broken windows, broken appliances, things beyond normal wear and tear? What's the main way? There it is, Marcus. The money in the form of the security deposit. You got it. It might be that they run out of security deposit money compared to all the things that the tenant has done wrong, too, by the way. We'll talk about that in a minute. What the tenant cannot do is stop paying the rent. They're not allowed under the Residential Rental Agreements Act to stop paying the rent. What if the property is unsafe? What if wires are showing? It's tripping hazard. The stairs are wobbly. Somebody could fall off the stair. So it's definitely not what the landlord's supposed to do. The landlord is violating his end of the bargain too. Can the tenant stay there and stop paying the rent sort of in protest because the place is not safe anymore? Is that allowable for the tenant to stop paying rent while still living there? What if they truly are in a place that's not safe? Is there a way they could stop paying rent legally? How could they do this if it's because the place is not repaired, kept in good repair? You're getting there. There's a sort of a little catch to it. They could stop paying the rent, but not while they're living there. They'd have to move out. So there is a case where if it's not kept in good repair, the tenant's not forced to stay there. The tenant could leave and stop paying the rent. And what that's called is constructive eviction. This is one of four kinds of eviction. I'll give you a spoiler. Only one of them is about the tenant misbehaving. The other three are about the landlord doing something wrong. So these four kinds of eviction, the first one we're learning about is when the landlord doesn't keep up their end of the bargain as per the Residential Rental Agreements Act. They don't keep it safe. They don't get it repaired quickly enough. So therefore, the tenant is allowed to move out and stop paying the rent. They are evicting themselves constructively because the landlord failed to keep the premises habitable. They evict themselves. They can move out and stop paying the rent. They can't stop paying the rent and still live there, though. That'd be a problem. Another kind of eviction, let's do all the landlord bad guy versions first. Another kind is, what if the landlord is trying to drive the tenant out of there? And there's been several cases before. There was one in Charlotte where the landlord took the front door off the property. The tenant came home and there was no door. They also could turn off the utilities, like in the winter. That'd be a big problem, or in the summer. Not life-threatening, but annoying in the summer. Winter could be life-threatening. Changing the locks, taking off door, and it's not allowed. It's weirdly called peaceable self-help, but you could also just see it on the test as self-help eviction. The landlord is helping themselves to try to intimidate or bully the tenant into leaving. Illegal. Not okay. Self-help eviction, not allowed. The lessor means the landlord. They're trying to force the leasee tenant out of the building. So constructive eviction was because the landlord didn't repair stuff. Tenant repeatedly tried to get him to do so, and they still didn't fix it. Tenant finally says, I just can't live here anymore. I'm moving out and stop paying rent. And if they could prove this stuff, then they'd probably have a pretty good case. The other one is the landlord trying to drive the tenant out for maybe not even because the tenant's being bad. Maybe the tenant is doing something wrong. Even if the tenant is late on their rent or playing the music too loud all the time or doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, the landlord still does not have the right to do this. Landlords still can't exercise self-help eviction. They've got to go through the typical eviction process. Let's look at the last one that the landlord is the bad guy over. If a tenant decides to maybe either join a tenants' rights association, maybe this landlord has a bad reputation, they don't fix anybody's stuff. And so all the tenants try to get together to form a group. And they try to form some sort of tenants' rights association or join one. The landlord cannot evict you because you tried to do that. Or if you, instead of that, complain to a government agency about the landlord or ask for repairs to be done. The landlord couldn't be mad about all of these things, any of these things, and say, well, because you did these things that are within your rights to do, by the way, I'm still mad about it, so I'm going to evict you. You got to leave. Guess what? That's illegal. It's called retaliatory eviction. The landlord's getting them back for something that they are mad that they did. The thing is, all those things that they did here on this list are okay and allowable and legal. Tenant can't be evicted for asserting their legal rights. If the landlord tries to do so, the tenant not only gets to stay, but they are protected from eviction for 12 months. That's retaliatory eviction. So those are the 3 out of the 4 where the landlord is being a jerk. Retaliatory, constructive, because the tenant can't live there anymore. They got to move out and they're allowed to stop paying because the landlord wouldn't keep it safe and habitable. And then this third one, peaceable self-help. So we talked about this one and we said that what if the tenant was in the wrong? Even if the tenant is in the wrong and violating provisions in the lease, the landlord can't just force them out. The landlord's got to do what? What is a proper legal way the landlord can get rid of that tenant eventually? It's the 4th and the more commonly thought of version of eviction. And the weird thing is, the word eviction isn't even in the official title for what this thing is. It's called summary ejectment. So when a landlord is kicking a tenant out because they stayed past their time from being there or violated terms of their lease, they're going to have to go to court over it. They've got to go file it with the court. They got to go to court and prove to the judge, look, they're not supposed to do this. Here's the lease in writing, and they're doing these things. And I've got proof of it. They've got to go through the motions. Yes, it could take a while. Yes, they're not going to be out tomorrow. At the very quickest, they probably wouldn't be out for 30 days. But a savvy tenant that really knows the law, they could end up staying in there, trashing your property for 60 days or 90 days. A tenant who knows their rights could milk it. They would have to show up at the court hearing, come up with some sort of story, and maybe the best proof they've got, maybe have an attorney. And it's not just super easy to kick somebody out. Tenants aren't easily evicted. You'd have to have all your stuff in order. So this process, this typical eviction that everybody thinks of, classic eviction, is officially called summary ejectment. Summary ejectment, the only legal method for a landlord evicting a tenant. Summary ejectment. It's judicial, meaning you got to go to court and get the judge involved. I had a listing and the owner was in Arizona, but she was here for a minute and she saw my sign in the house next door, in the yard of the house next door. She called me. She said, here's the deal. My daughter and her boyfriend live in the house. We're not on good terms. The boyfriend is a deadbeat. He was operating his business, this is her words, out of the house. His business was painting motorcycles, called powder coating. It required like a special big box that you put the parts in and let them cure and dry. He had a four-wheeler disassembled in front of the fireplace in the living room. He had motorcycle parts in the bedroom, trashing the hardwood floors, scratching and gouging the hardwood floors. He was supposed to do repair work on the kitchen. She let him rent it without it being completed. Part of the deal was that he would complete the stuff, and he never did. And he had this huge 7 foot tall by 6 foot cube. You could actually open up the door and walk in. But that's where he would, once he powder coated the parts, he'd hang them up in there to let them dry and cure in the dining room. And he's got 55-gallon barrels in the backyard with who knows what was in those. Something toxic, probably. And so, yay, I got a new listing. So I put it on the market. It was a couple of years ago. It took a while. Every time he was amazingly easy. He let everybody come look at it. But he trashed his potential mother-in-law every time. He talked about the property, talked about her, tried to sabotage it. No, amazingly, no. It did not have a particular smell. I guess in the garage it had a chemically smell. I tried not to stay there too much. They had also taken the ceiling out of the garage and spray foamed the roof, but the roof leaked. And so they had to chip away the foam. And so you could actually see the back of the shingles for about a 5 foot square part of the garage. The roof was pretty much blown. And so we got it sold eventually, but she tried to kick him out, obviously. She tried to evict him. But one of the things that helped him was right about that time, the COVID eviction freeze took place. If you could halfway remotely say that you had COVID, they're not evicting anybody. And so he was locked in there until he was good and ready. And so I got the listing in November. He didn't leave until July. But we got a contract in January. And that was a smart buyer because they said, you know what? I'll sit and wait. I don't care that he's still there. I don't want to close on it while he's still there. I'm not going to inherit the problem of trying to evict him. But whenever he does leave, I'll be here and ready and willing to close on it. And she was smart to do that because that meant that she had no competition. Otherwise, she would have had to compete with multiple offers on everything else. And I think she had already experienced that life. So she was ready just to sit and wait. So she had to from January when we went into contract to July. And it worked out. And I think my seller owner, client, no, that's cool, Yvonne, tried at least twice to take him to court, and both times she was too cocky. She thought for sure she had the right proof, but he wiped the floor with her. He came there ready to go and had like an attorney, and he had documentation, and she was not prepared, and she lost handily. He came ready to go, and he stayed. I think he somehow thought he was going to be able to squat his way into owning it, be a squatter, but it didn't work out in the long run. He did finally leave. But this is what she tried to do, is summary ejectment, the classic way of evicting someone. Okay, let's talk about the money. What is it that keeps a tenant financially in check from damaging the property? What do they have to lose? The security deposit. And so there is legislation surrounding that money called the Tenant Security Deposit Act. It spells out how you got to handle that money. If the owner / landlord is not a real estate license holder, not one of you after you pass the PSI, if there's someone without a license, then they can accomplish the goal of this tenant security deposit. They can either put the money in a trust account, or they could take out a bond for that amount of money. Usually with the bond method, the tenant will pay 10% of the coverage or something, and then that bond company will pay out if they are required to, if the money needs to be paid out. So they could do either one. They could either be bonded or put the money in a trust account. They're not allowed to use the bond method if they are an actual licensee. If the owner has a real estate license, they have to hold the trust money in a trust account. And it can't be the main firm trust account where all the other earnest money and stuff is kept. If the owner is a licensee, they've got to have their own personal trust account for their rental properties. They could put they own like 5 rental properties on their own. Yes, they could put all 5 into that one personal trust account, but it can't be the firm trust account. And then the money that's required, how much is the most that they can collect? Not the most that they'd like to collect, I'll tell you that. The most they're allowed to collect for security deposit depends on how long the lease is. We gave you a little hint, a little advance notice of that last hour. If it's a week-to-week lease, then the most they can charge and collect from the tenant is 2 weeks' rent. 2 weeks of rent when it's a week-to-week lease. If it's a month-to-month lease, the most is 1.5 months worth. And if it's over a month-to-month duration, then the most they can collect for security deposit is 2 months worth. Anybody have 2 months security deposit out there in the place that you're renting or ever have? I've heard of 1 month. I haven't seen many that's 2. I'm wondering if maybe right now a lot more are going to 2 because it's such a landlord's market. It's a seller's market for purchasing. It's a landlord's market for renting. Wouldn't surprise me if they bumped up to 2. If they have a long list of people out the door just waiting to hopefully please let me rent from you, then I could see them going up. So again, the notice that's required as well as the amount of security deposit are both dependent upon how long that lease is for. What can we use the security deposit for? Before I show you the answers, you tell me, what sorts of things could the landlord keep and use the security deposit to go toward? Damage over normal wear and tear. Yep. That's a big one. Let's get creative. Definitely things that need to be fixed. Yeah, but there's a good one, Catherine. If they don't pay rent, making up the rent that they didn't pay. Sure. Back rent, non-payment of rent. That's a good one. Keep going. There's like 6 total. Got to be proactive. What else? What's another way they could violate their lease besides stopping paying rent? What if they decided to go ahead and buy a place, but they have 8 more months to go on their lease? They try to move out early. That landlord is going to be shorted by 8 months of rent. And so that tenant security deposit could go toward non-fulfillment of the rental period. There we go. So you've hit most of them. You've hit a couple of them. Non-payment of rent, of course. Damage beyond normal wear and tear. Not staying there the full term. It could also be that they didn't pay some bills, and those bills resulted in a lien against the property. Maybe like a utility bill or something. So those unpaid bills that became a lien against the property could be paid using the tenant security deposit. Let's see, do they have to wait until the lease is up? No, but if they leave early, there's usually a lease break or a lease penalty. You could pay an amount of money to get out of the lease early. So that'd be what was expected. This is just talking about if they were to leave early and not pay anything, not pay a lease break fee and just disappear in the middle of the night. They are still going to be faced with not getting their security deposit back. What about this one? The property, they left early, and so the landlord now needs to re-rent the property. It's going to cost money to run the ad, going to cost money to do a couple of the things involved in re-renting. And then what if you have to evict them? The court costs of eviction. All of these things could be what you use that security deposit for. But let's think about it. How much could these add up to? I mean, good grief. If it's a year lease, the most you could collect for a security deposit is 2 months. If it's $2,000 a month, there's $4,000. Could we get to $4,000 real quick with any combination of these 6 items? Sure we could. So quite frequently that landlord might, even though they get to keep all the security deposit, still be shorted, still be lacking the full amount that the tenant has cost them. So these are just for the test purposes what you need to know about the uses of that tenant security deposit. When they're settling up with this security deposit, the landlord needs to prepare a preliminary security deposit statement and then a final one. The preliminary one is due within 30 days of the end of the lease. They're going to say, look, we saw that you've had crayon marks, you got some pretty major pet damage, you've got this and that and the other, therefore we're going to keep half of your security deposit or all of it. That's in the preliminary. And then the 60 days after the end of the lease is when they would settle it all up, give them their final check, if any, if they're going to give them any refund of the security deposit, and basically say, here's what we did, here's why we did it, here's why we kept all of it or kept half of it or whatever. So that preliminary statement is due within 30 days of the end of lease. The final security deposit statement is due 60 days after. What about pets? Are people allowed to have pets in a rental? So I told you I'm selling this place, and so I'm getting ready for September when the closing happens, hopefully. At that point, I'll have 3 months to move out. They're going to let me stay 3 months after closing. So I want to kind of know what's out there, what to expect. And so I've been looking at rentals, and I've got 3 dogs at the moment. I might have 2 by then, bless his heart, because the old one, he's hanging in there, but I just don't know. Every day I'm wondering, what am I going to wake up to find? But if I have 3 dogs, I'm seeing $300 pet fees. And some of them want pet rent, not just a pet fee. We're not even talking about pet rent here on this next slide. There we go. But holy cow, holy dogs, I'm going to be paying some rent. Anyway, the landlord doesn't have to allow pets, but if they do allow pets, they might charge a fee, and that fee is non-refundable. It's sort of like due diligence fee. You're not getting that back. It's just for the privilege of getting to have that pet there. What about the damage the pet is doing? That's not what this fee is about. The fee is about the privilege of having the pet. The damage would be covered with the security deposit, right? Hopefully, maybe not covered, and then obviously, as we see in today's rental market that I just reported to you, we're seeing higher fees because they can get it. Because why not? That's just economics, supply and demand. Landlord is allowed to charge a separate, but it would be non-refundable fee for pets. And since it's non-refundable, does that mean the landlord can spend it, or do they have to hold it in a trust account? Do they get to spend it right away? I kind of gave you the answer. But yeah, if it's a non-refundable fee, that's the sort of how that works. So when you're moving out, you're not getting this thing back. Therefore, they can use that money to go buy their own pet if they want to. What about this one? I saw this just the other day. Yesterday, I think, a guy was kicked out of a restaurant because he had a service animal. That is a big problem. Big no-no. And so when it comes to rental units, same thing. Can you turn down a tenant because they have a service animal? No. That is a major fair housing violation. Can they charge a pet fee? Can the landlord charge you a pet fee if you have a service animal? That would imply that the animal is a pet, which it is not. That animal is an employee, right? It's like a service person. There is no such thing. But if you had a person who helped you, and there is such a thing as that, like a nurse or a person who kind of helps you go out and do chores, it's essentially that. You can't charge a pet fee or refuse to rent to someone because they have the need for a service animal. But at the end of the day, it's still an animal, and it still might cause a mess, but so might your friend from high school that you let stay the night. But this tenant security deposit covers that one too, right? If they cause a big enough damage or mess, the service animal or otherwise, yes, those repair expenses could be deducted from the security deposit. But you can't charge anything extra. That would be violating their rights under fair housing to have a service animal. They would need to have proper documentation that it wasn't just a fancy vest they bought on Amazon that said service animal. That's not what it means to have a service animal. The damage is for, again, beyond normal wear and tear, and it applies to things like excessive big holes in the carpet, not just from things wearing down, holes in the walls, broken windows, crayon marks. So that's what we're talking about, and that's what the tenant would be responsible for. The Vacation Rental Act, now we're outside of the Residential Rental Agreements Act. We're talking about the short-term vacation rentals. This act is for leases that go for less than 90 days. It applies when the tenant also has a primary residence somewhere. Tenant has a primary residence. This isn't their primary place. It's a 90-day or less than 90-day lease. And if the person puts that vacation rental up for sale, sells it to a new owner, the new owner has to honor leases that are already in place for 180 days. They can't just stop it and say, I want to stay here. I just bought it. It's nice and shiny and new at the beach. I don't want to let anybody else. Sorry, no, that's part of the deal. You got to honor existing leases for 180 days for that vacation rental. That's about it. That's about all there is to it for vacation rentals. The eviction process, as we learned in a recent continuing ed class a couple years ago, is heightened, shortened. So since it's probably like a week, oftentimes 1 week or a weekend rental, vacation rental, if the person is misbehaving so bad they need to be evicted, it's going to be like a day or two eviction process that would be handled in front of a magistrate, not a judge duty. Public housing, also called Section 8. What are we talking about with Section 8? What's going on in a Section 8 property? There you go. You're getting help. The government is kicking in some or all of the rent, subsidized, yeah. Someone has gone through an application process, proven that they need help, and it's part of the program. It's rental assistance, yeah. So a person who is renting a Section 8 property can't be evicted unless you have very good cause. They'd want to definitely make sure that it's not that a landlord is trying to end the Section 8 situation. They're not just trying to get him out so they don't have to be Section 8 anymore. In fact, most landlords who do Section 8 are happy to do it because they know they're going to get that rent because the government's paying it, right? And the person who's living there is probably well behaved because they had to do a lot to get into the program. They don't want to jeopardize that. So you'd have to really prove with good cause that the person needs to be evicted. It's got to be clearly the tenant's fault. There's still a process, a procedural process involved. Can't just say, oh, no, be gone. You didn't pay. You'd have to go through the process. And then, again, with fair housing laws, I think we might get to that tonight. The classes, the 7 protected classes that we'll learn about in Chapter 19. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, I believe there is a field for that. There's a field for everything, and I'm pretty sure I've done searches like that before. May not. In fact, they don't really call it Section 8, that word anymore, but you can look it up under government assistance or some sort of thing like that. But yeah, that's available. And then the other question, if you have an investor who wants to have the Section 8 tenants, then another one might be for them to go through and learn what it is for a property to qualify for it. Because that's the other thing. Can you convert your property to Section 8? Yes. But again, you've got to go to the housing authority, the local housing authority in the market, the town is who you would contact about this stuff. Local housing authority is the one who's in charge of that money. The money's coming from the federal government, from HUD, but the local is what's kind of putting all those pieces together. And when it's a tenant trying to find Section 8 places, they would go to the housing authority and say, where's the list? Which places allow it? And then when it's the housing authority is another term for it. When it's a landlord who wants to make their property available for Section 8, you better believe they're going to have to make sure it suits all the requirements of habitability and safety. There's a list. They'd have to apply and say, can this property be used for Section 8 tenants? Oh, no. What do I need to do? I need to add railings or I don't know, whatever. So there's an application process for them too, for the property itself. Yeah, sure. Fair housing classes that we'll learn about in Unit 19, the protected classes are 7. And it's race, religion, familial status, color, national origin, disability, and sex. I think that's all 7. The sex one includes gender identity, sexual orientation. Basically, we make real estate available to everybody. We don't try to not allow someone in those classes, particularly to not have access to it. And that's the gist. It's such a big deal that if your owner client, you're the property manager, if the landlord who owns the property violates fair housing, you, the licensee, could also be held liable because it's on you to explain to them what the deal is and what these classes are and what it means to violate them and versus not. Same thing for the landlord. The landlord is liable for the actions of the broker they hire. I mean, this is heightened, right? Huge level of responsibility here. On top of that, if you end up being sued over it, times the amount of damages by 3. We saw that back when we studied RESPA. If it's a RESPA violation, Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, automatic treble damages, times it by 3. Same for fair housing. Real Estate Commission does not play. You would go to the Department of HUD for a federal fair housing complaint. You'd go to I'll remember it by the time we get to the chapter, but a different one for the state, if it's a state fair housing complaint that you need to file. And we'll learn more about it in that chapter here in a moment, a couple chapters away. So what sorts of provisions might be in a rental agreement? The main rental agreement that we have access to, the North Carolina Association of Realtors one that's already pre-printed with blanks that we can fill in. Things like how much is the rent? Things like what happens if the rent gets returned? You write a bounce check. Who's going to pay for utilities? What's the process for eviction? What is the situation about quiet enjoyment? When can the landlord come in? Can they just come in? No. What kind of notice are they required to give? All that is spelled out. And pets. Check the box if you allow pets. And how much is the pet fee? Fill in the blank. So there is a standard rental agreement that is available. Let me check something here. Oh, there we go. No, that's not quite it. I'll have it. There we go. That's what I think I want. So let me show you just a couple of these provisions of a typical lease. This is the one that's available to us. It's 8 pages. You can see it's made by the NCAR, North Carolina Association of Realtors. We've got the Fair Housing logo as always on these forms that they've given us. And it's a residential rental contract. Of course, we got it between the tenant and the landlord. If there's an agent, they'd fill it out there. And there should be, because this is a form that would be used with an agent's involvement, because it's got to have a realtor involved to use a realtor form. So we've got a term. The term is spelled out right there at the top. Obviously, the address, the rent amount, and how frequently, month, week, year. What happens if you're late? Is there a late fee, a return check fee? How much is the security deposit? It's all the stuff we were just talking about right here on the front page. They don't waste any time. Where is it going to be held? What's the name of the bank of the trust account? And the address. Got to know where their money is. What are the fees for summary ejectment? A complaint filing fee, a court appearance fee. I'm not saying you need to know all these things. I just want you to see some of these things we were talking about kind of in action, where they actually apply. Here's another one that people try to violate. How many people can live there, right? Who is permitted to be occupants there? The renewal, if it can renew, it's going to become what kind of a rental? And let's see what else. Talks about the security deposit some more. What's the tenant obligated to do? They've using it for residential purposes only. Can't disturb the other tenants. Can't use it for unlawful or immoral purposes. Got to keep it safe and habitable, including plumbing fixtures, appliances. Can't be unsafe and unsanitary. Throw your trash away. Comply with building and housing codes. We saw all that stuff in the slides. Throw stuff away. There's the garbage. Use things in the proper manner they're supposed to be used. Don't destroy things. And you're responsible if you do. Pay for your utilities. Don't vacate or abandon during the initial term. If you are deemed to have abandoned, or the definition of is if you've removed most of your stuff. No smoking. And then a big series of blank lines to modify this thing. Talks about the landlord responsibilities to comply with code, to make repairs, to keep common areas safe, to repair things. Let's see. Again. And then if it's imminently dangerous, they need to repair or remedy faster. Talks about utilities and check the box. Who's going to cover those? Landlord, tenant. Talks about the alarms. If there is one, if there is a gas appliance, then you need to also have a carbon monoxide detector, because if a gas appliance fails, it could emit carbon monoxide, and that's a silent killer. You could just wake up dead. You just sleep to death. And then it says the landlord puts new batteries in smoke and carbon monoxide alarms, but the tenant replaces them. And that's what I was saying earlier. Forget it. I'll just do it. I want to make sure that gets done. Then it talks about owners association stuff. Right of entry. The landlord reserves the right to enter during reasonable hours, make repairs as they deem appropriate, show to prospective tenants, display a sign. And here's the part about pets, if allowed. There's a thing about alterations. Tenants not going to do significant alterations. They can put hang pictures from a hook in the wall, but that'd be a reasonable amount sized hole. Can't just be this huge amount of damage. And that's pretty much all the stuff we talked about. If there's some addenda, they've got some places to. There's a pet addendum that's we check the box: assistance animal, military status. So that's what it looks like out there in the wild. And with that, we're pretty much done with Landlord Tenant. When we come back from break, we'll talk about property management. That's the next chapter. And I'll see you in 10 minutes. together. Come back together. It's about 30 more seconds. Okay, halfway done. Let's move on to property management. That's the one. There we go. All right. So again, that last one was landlord tenant. That's about the lease between the owner of the property and the tenant who's renting it. Now we're talking about the equivalent of a listing agreement. That owner of property is tired of managing this thing themselves. They want to hire a broker to do it. They've got to hire a broker. You can't do property management without a broker's license. But do you want to do all those little details? You could hire unlicensed people and pay them a salary, a W-2 salary as a property managing broker. And they could do a lot of stuff. They can, in fact, do some things that normally require a real estate license. But because they are a W-2 salaried employee, they're allowed to do some real estate without a license, as long as they are in that situation. So we're going to get into the agreement and the relationship between the owner of the property and the broker they hire to manage it for them. What are those duties? What are the responsibilities? What sorts of things are they doing? Number one, when you pass the PSI exam, don't try to jump straight into property management because you can't. You got to be a non-provisional broker. You have to take those post classes, get those done. Then you can be a property managing broker. You could, of course, work for one, but you couldn't do it yourself and be the property manager until you get rid of your provisional status. And of course, you'd have to be on active status too. It could also be that you are operating as an entity, as a C or an S corporation, titled in the name of that corporation, and you can hire employees and pay them a salary, a W-2 hourly or salary kind of situation. And they can be unlicensed. When it comes to being a property manager, there are definitely some differences between what you do on behalf of your client compared to what you do on behalf of your client in a sale. When you're helping a buyer buy a property, you would never sign the contract on their behalf. You're going to give them advice. You're going to guide them through the process, but you wouldn't sign anything. But when it comes to being a property manager, you could sign some stuff. And you do, in fact, do more than you would in a sale. Because as a property manager, don't forget you are a general agent. What are the three? General's the one in the middle. What's the lowest form of agency? General's the one for property managers and also agents working for a firm. But then the lowest amount of agency, it's not that same thing as buyer agency, listing agency, sub-agency. It's not those words. There it is. Special. A special agent, think about James Bond. Special agent can't sign for the client. They can help them. They can advise them. But that's about it. A general agent is what a property manager is. They can sign leases. They can spend some money of the clients because that's why they're being hired, because that owner of property doesn't want to deal with that stuff. The highest form of agency in this list of three is universal agency. That's a good example of that as an attorney. An attorney can be given full responsibility for everything in your life, or any combination, any variety of that. And a non-attorney could too, if you give them the power of attorney, right? If you make them your attorney in fact, which basically gives them the power to sign on your behalf. But we're just talking about general agency here when it comes to property management, because they are being hired for two main purposes. That owner wants them to preserve the value of the property, make sure it doesn't go down in value for any sort of actions that they do, and generate income, because we're talking about income producing property. And so if you take the revenue and subtract out how much it costs to run that little business called a investment property or income property, what you are left with is the profit, the net profit. And that's what the property manager is responsible for. They might increase the net profit by reducing the expenses, or by increasing the revenue, or a little bit of both. Maybe they come in and they're the new person. The old property manager didn't do a great job, so the owner hires a new one. That new one has some ideas of ways to reduce expenses, has other ideas of ways to add more income. They can get more rent. That could be anywhere from building some garages, so some of the tenants can rent, pay extra to have some storage, or boat docks if you're on the water, something like that. Expenses could be, are we paying the best possible insurance policy? Is it the cheapest, or has it gone up? Could we shop around and get a better one, better rate? Utilities, are we okay on utilities, or do we need an on-site manager? Are we paying a person to be on site and we could pay less or not need them altogether? They're running a business. That property management agreement, remember, we need to relate it to the listing agreement. Is there any such thing as oral listing agreement? There is no such thing as oral listing agency. There's oral buyer agency. But before you start marketing a property for sale, you've got to have it in writing that you have permission to do so. Same thing here. Before you start managing someone's rental property, you've got to have it in writing, just like a listing agreement for selling. That property management agreement is also like the listing agreement, because it's going to spell out what that property manager is responsible for. What is their authority? What are they authorized to do on behalf of the owner? And here is where it's different from a listing agreement. This is the big difference, the red one. A listing agreement has to have an expiration. You could never build into a listing agreement and say, I will list all of your properties forever and ever that you ever own. Not allowed. Every agency agreement has to have an expiration, except this one. This is one kind of agency agreement, and it is, in fact, an agency agreement, right? You're hiring a broker. It involves agency. This is the only one that can automatically renew. So basically, as long as that property manager doesn't completely screw up, they're going to keep being the property manager from 1 year to the next. Because why would you want to go through the hassle of interviewing and hiring a new one if they're not messing up? As long as they're doing the good job, I would just keep the same one in place, unless their fees went up unexplainedly, or they just didn't hold up their end. So that's a good testable item. Property management agreement is the only kind of agency agreement that can renew automatically. You can renew any of them, but not automatically, except for this one. Like a listing agreement, when you're selling a property, you could say, look, seller, next week, this thing expires. You only gave me 3 months. It expires next week. Are we cool? Do you want me to just keep trying? Here, sign this renewal so that we can just keep on going. That'd be how a listing agreement might work. But a property management agreement wouldn't even require that. If you had it built in, this renews until it doesn't. If you want to fire me, let me know. But otherwise, owner, I'm going to expect and assume that you're cool and you're going to let me keep doing my job. just like a listing agreement, it's going to spell out the various the various parties' responsibilities. It's going to describe the property. What are we managing? What's the period of time? What is the manager responsible for? What's the owner responsible for? That might involve paying or reimbursing the manager for money that needs to be spent for things, or being responsive so the manager can get things handled if the tenant has problems. What sorts of expectations are there for how frequently the property manager checks in and tells the owner the status of their property? Maybe monthly, maybe sooner, maybe later, maybe quarterly. And then how do we end this thing if we want to? We need to spell out how to terminate this property management agreement. So again, just think about the lease versions of the things that would show up in a listing for sale agreement. Now, here are the exceptions. These next 4 things are highly testable. You could see any of these things pop up on a test question. Out of all the various things a property manager would do for an owner, these are what they would never do for an owner. Not allowed. Property manager never is in charge of making capital improvements. What is a capital improvement? Give me an example of a capital improvement on let's just say a rental single family house. What could be a capital improvement? Yeah, adding anything. A pool would be a terrible idea, but that would be a capital improvement. Can we say liability? Adding playground, that's probably another terrible idea. Adding a room, maybe turning the carport into a garage. Adding things that could make kids kill themselves is probably a terrible idea. But adding of things is what we're talking about with capital improvements. An apartment complex that might make capital improvements by adding a gym. Maybe they add a workout facility. Maybe they have another building nearby that they could upfit or fix up and turn into like storage, some mini storage available to whoever wants to pay extra for it. So a property manager is not responsible for that. That's not what you're going to be doing. If you're managing the property, that is not in your job description. If the owner wants to make capital improvements, they need to go hire a contractor and go get that squared away with someone else, not you. A property manager also, they are reporting back to that owner and maybe cutting them a check and saying, look, here's what we made this month. After you paid me, after you paid the overhead, the operating stuff, the mortgage, we made money. What do you want me to do with that money? That is not a question that a property manager would ask. The only thing a property manager does with the leftover money is give it to the owner. And then the owner decides how they want to handle those profits. The property manager, in other words, is not a financial planner, not an investment person. It is not their role to do something with the profits besides give them to the owner. They would never reinvest them. They are also not a CPA. They will not pay the owner's income tax with the proceeds. They're going to give the owner what's left after running this little business called an income property. It could be a big business, could be a high-rise building downtown for that matter. But after all of the expenses are paid out, they're going to give the owner what's left, and it's up to the owner to handle paying their own income tax. That does not fall under the purview of what the property manager is responsible for doing. And then establishing a depreciation schedule for tax purposes is not in the scope of what a property manager would do. Keeping track of how much the property is getting, how much wear and tear it has, so that you can claim some tax deductions over that. What kind of professional would an owner need to hire to establish a depreciation schedule, if not their property manager? You got it. That's what I would hire, Marcus says, a CPA, some kind of tax person, right? Not us. We're just real estate brokers. So these are 4 things property manager never does: capital improvements, reinvest profit, pay the owner's income tax, and establish a depreciation schedule. I was trying to see if I could make an acronym real quick off the top of my head. I'll work on that. If you come up with one, let me know. Do acronyms help? Sometimes they do. There's a good one. Okay. Look at you. Holly came up with one already. Perm. I'll just need to reorganize these things on this slide and then put a picture of maybe, who is it? Who's the golden girl? My wife's watching Golden Girls reruns. Who's the old one? She had a perm, right? That's coming. I'll bring it. I'll have that done ready for you next time. Oh, that's even better. Look at you. You're stealing my job. Okay. Stop it. What does a property manager do? They have to put a plan together. They need to say, okay, owner, what do you want me to accomplish in this role? Guess what? When you go for a listing appointment to list a property for sale, you say, hey, owner, what do you want me to accomplish with this deal? You're hiring me. What do you want me to do? That's the best kind of listing presentation you could ever do. My favorite way to list a property or to do the presentation is not some elaborate PowerPoint, although I do have one available. I don't just pull it out there and put it on the table and make them look at it and be like, oh my gosh, how long is this going to take? I don't want to scare them. And I certainly am not going to bring out a big catalog of a flip book like back in the old days, because if they're not that personality type of the engineer, kind of a accountant who wants every detail, it's going to cause anxiety. My favorite is a blank piece of paper or a pad. And I'll just sit there and say, why am I here? How can I help you? What are you most concerned about? And they will tell me what my answers need to be back to them. What is it going to take for me to get hired? You tell me. What do you want? And we'll make it happen. This is the same idea. From a property manager perspective, hey, owner, what are you trying to accomplish? Did you have someone else who kind of didn't really stay on top of things, didn't keep you informed, maybe didn't advise you on what the competition is doing down the street so that you can maybe increase the rents and have a justification for increasing the rents, or keep track of the vacancy rate? And maybe we could increase rents because it's currently 100% occupied. Guess what? A 0% vacancy is probably not ideal, right? Did we talk about that before? It's probably going to make you more money if you set the rent a little higher so that the vacancy rate is more like 4 or 5%, because the resulting extra, all the ones that do get rented, are going to be for so much more. Even though you're a little bit empty, you're able to charge more for the ones that are renting there. So a typical property manager might give you that advice and say, look, out there in the real world, we don't want to see a 0 vacancy. We want to set the rent so that we maintain sort of a 3-4% vacancy rate. And that's part of your role as a property manager, giving them that advice, that update. Keeping track of what's going on in the neighborhood. There's a lot of stuff going on out there these days, a lot of construction. You can't drive 2 miles without seeing an apartment complex. I've got like 3 luxury apartment complexes within 5 miles of my house that aren't even open yet, because that's what the market's dictating. And so it'd be good for a property manager of any one of those to know what the competition looks like. What do you get down the street for only $300 more per month, or even less per month? Do we need to do something to compete? So doing a neighborhood analysis, doing a property analysis, just like when you're listing a home for sale, we would look at the competition too. We would do a CMA, like we learned in 17, based on the solds, but we're also going to look at the actives, the things that are actively for sale, so that we can see what else is out there and what those potential buyers are going to go look at after they leave our listing. We're going to do the same thing as a property manager. What do renters have to pick from? And they do financial stuff. They're going to provide proof that they're making money, show where the money's flowing, cash flow report, operating budget, income and expense reports. Property manager is sort of a combination of a real estate broker and a CPA and a bookkeeper, right? They've got this vehicle, this investment vehicle, and they've got to justify and prove where this money is going. I received it from these renters, and I processed it by paying out all the bills, and now I'm passing along the profits to you, Mr. Owner. And how do you want me to do it? Are you happy? What else can I do? What are your goals of the property? Do we want to increase the net operating income somehow? Can we decrease the operating expenses and increase the gross income by raising the rent to improve the bottom line of that NOI? And that's not even the very bottom of the line. The bottom line is the cash flow, and everybody knows that term. Cash flow is what happens after we finally subtract out the loan amount. The loan payment, the debt service. So while NOI only accounts for operating expenses and vacancy and collection, cash flow goes a little further and also factors in the debt service. So that includes renting the property. That's part of the property manager duties, keeping it up, maintaining it. What's involved with maintaining the property? What else could be involved with doing that? Is that just going to be the property manager showing up with a broom and a dustpan, or what are they going to be doing to help maintain it? Housekeeping, landscape, keep things mowed and trimmed, hiring people. Maybe we outsource. Maybe we have some staff that does some of this stuff. How big is the project? Big enough that we need to have our own crew? Environmental concerns, making sure that there is no polluting, no toxic problems. They're also responsible for adhering to the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. ADA is all about making a publicly accessible property accessible to everyone. And so ADA laws impact property manager responsibilities because they've got to make sure if it's a big enough place, like an apartment complex, there's a model, there's an office, and they usually have a furnished space for you to look at. And so it's got to be, there's the curbs need to have ramps so that wheelchairs can access it. Got to have bathrooms accessible if it's over a certain number of employees. So the property manager is making sure the public can access it through ADA responsibilities and also employees. I think if it's over 15 employees, you've got to follow ADA responsibilities. You would have to have a working bathroom that's accessible. I live here in this tri-level home for a minute. Once upon a time, way in the past, I thought about maybe opening, since it's basically zoned commercial, kind of upfitting it, turning the front room and the main level into like a real estate office. But there's no bathroom on that main level. The closest bathroom is 5 steps up. And if I'd had 15 employees or grown to that point, then I would have had to figure out a bathroom solution. So you can't just turn any old house into an office. Sometimes, like in Charlotte, they've got some old historic houses, and in the back they have this elaborate wheelchair ramp because they have to, so that they can accommodate the ADA rules and laws for accessibility. And it's a property manager's responsibility to make sure all that is in compliance. When it comes to risk, property manager is managing and reducing that risk if at all possible. If they can avoid it, they're going to remove the source of the risk. Speaking of pools, maybe you get a single family property for a great deal, but it has a pool and you want to turn it to a rental. 99% of the time, that person's going to remove the pool. Nobody wants to rent something with a pool, just because it's got that extra level of responsibility. Retaining risk, insuring the property with a large deductible, that'd be on the on the shoulders of the property manager to shop for the insurance policies and give the owner advice. Controlling it by putting in the proper safety equipment, sprinklers. What kind of sprinklers? Is it a commercial property, like a big warehouse? And do they handle certain types of flammable products? So is a water-related suppression system okay, or does it need to be like the powder kind? Fire suppression comes in all kinds of forms. It's not just squirting water on the fire. That might be the worst thing you could do. So knowing which and researching and finding out which kinds of safety devices, fire doors are required, and transferring that risk by ensuring proper insurance, ensuring proper insurance policies are in place so that if it all goes sideways, you've got a payout from this insurance company. Are you properly insured? One big thing that's become an issue in the industry, both residentially and commercial, is as fast as properties have appreciated in the last couple of years, people have not realized that they are underinsured. If they wanted to rebuild their house, they're insured for the values from 3 years ago, but now they're worth 25% more. And so would they get enough money paid out from the policy if it burned down to get back what they've got now, or would they get a significant amount less and have to rebuild something a lot less? So good idea if you're a broker to reach out to your past clients and say, just curious, have you checked your insurance? We closed something for 3 years ago. Are you insured enough? Do you need me to print some comparables for you to show your insurance company to make sure that you've got adequate coverage so that you could be made whole again? Because if you're insured for $300,000 but it's worth $600 now, are you okay? Same thing applies commercially. So a property manager would want to make sure the adequate coverage is in place. And that involves current replacement cost, depreciated value, what type of coverage is needed, interacting with that insurance agent to make sure that's squared away. Guess what? Property managers want to get paid, and they get paid commission, just like we do on sales, but their commission is based on the monthly rent. So it could look something like this. The commission that they charge might be 10% of each month's rent. And if we look at the lower left, if the monthly rent is $2,525 and we're charging 10% commission to manage the property, then what we're making for that 1 month for that one property is $252.50. It could be 8% per month, 9%. I've seen a range between 8 and 10 usually. No standard commission. It's all negotiable. And then if you take that $252.50 per month and multiply it out for the whole year on the right, your annual commission as a property manager for this property is $3,000 and some change. So this is something you might see on a calculation. But it's simple. It's pretty much the same thing as what you run into on sales, but we're dealing with per month, and they might extrapolate it out to the year. We okay there? Look at all those heads nodding. Good job. That's it. That is it for property management. I'm going to move on. There it is. Let's talk about fair housing. In this chapter, we're going to get into federal and state fair housing laws, how the enforcement happens, how that affects us as brokers. Affects us. Yeah, that's right. Talk about the classes, the protected classes themselves. I've mentioned them to you a couple times. Talk about the ADA again and define sexual harassment. We need to include that logo. I'm having my website overhauled and I had to make sure, put my realtor logo, my MLS logo, and this logo. somewhere on that website to make sure that the authorities, the real estate commission, the HUD, if I were ever involved in a complaint about fair housing with federal versus nat or state, I'd want to be able to show, look, I've tried. I've been made sure to disclose. And if I didn't have this logo in my various advertising, that could sort of be a red flag to the authorities, the powers that be who might be investigating me. Even if I were on the circumference, on the peripheral of a situation, I want to make sure this logo is out there and that I'm showing to the world that I'm adhering to fair housing laws, because we want to make sure that everybody has similar access to housing options. The only thing that differentiates your housing choices is your financial ability. That is not a protected class. You're not allowed to just buy any old thing. You got to buy something that you qualify for financially, but it shouldn't involve those protected classes. What are they? If you've heard the acronym Fresh Corn, we are not doing Fresh Corn anymore because finally the Realtor Association says, look, let's get rid of that word handicap from this whole concept. Let's talk about disability. Use the word disability, but the acronym still works. We're just going to rename it to Fred's Corn. And so that's a way you can remember these 7 protected classes. If we replace the E and the O from Fred's Corn with the words equal opportunity, then the rest of the acronym fits very nicely. And so you can remember the 7 classes this way. F for familial status. I think you've told me this before, but what does that mean? Familial status. Are we talking about who's allowed to marry who? Spouses? Or what are we talking about? There we go. It's not about spouses, it's about the kids. Are there any? Are there any underage kids? Can't discriminate against people with kids. That might come up in the rental sector. Somebody might say house for rent, single occupants only, like one person only. Well, you've just discriminated against someone that has a kid. They can't exactly let the kid live out in the yard, right? So can't say that. Can't be one person only. That'd be a violation of familial status. Race, disability, sex, color, religion, national origin. These protected classes are all spelled out and mentioned in all of the agency paperwork too, because they have to be in there. It's all bold and it's very clearly stated. And I usually will explain it in part this way. I'll say, look, this paragraph means that we don't care what anybody looks like, where they came from, what they believed in. Pretty much we're going to treat them all the same. Everybody has equal access to housing. We need to make sure that happens. And it's a good way to really watch your client and see if they flinch, see if that's something that sometimes somebody that might look like you might assume that you have the same nasty feelings and beliefs that they do. And so a good time to learn this about them is before you've invested your time into them. A bad time is once you've got 50, 60 hours into the transaction, and then you get wind that they're making choices based on protected classes rather than financial means and their own choice of, I have a better chance of closing this with this person because of this loan type. Then you've got to walk away because you've just discovered that this person's making these poor choices. Yeah, no. Let's go ahead and get it out on the table early. Try to let them at least know where you stand on the issue so that you can uncover that grossness sooner than later and say, you know what, I'm probably not the person for you. Going to distance myself from this situation. By the way, people could expect you to violate these things, obviously for the reason we're all thinking, but they could also expect you to violate them kind of almost innocently. And the reason I say that is it's just as illegal for you to help somebody who says, I don't want to tell me the neighborhoods that have this protected class in them because I don't want to live around them. That's obviously wrong. It's also wrong to say, tell me the neighborhoods that have this type of person there because I want to live around more people like me. I've had that happen. Little old lady, She said, I want to know where the so-and-so live because they're like me and I want to live around them. I didn't feel that she was being malicious. I didn't take offense. I just had to give her the same answer that I would have given a person who's telling me they don't want to live around a certain type of person. And I said, I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't help you with that. I can't give you advice on who lives where. That's a violation of fair housing laws and categories. You're going to have to just tell me what neighborhoods you want me to show you houses in. And it can't be that I'm directing you to a place because of who lives there. It can't be about the people. I can show you based on the property, but not about the people. Obviously, another big issue with fair housing is the advertising. How are you running ads? What are you talking about in the ads? And it's really effective to talk about the people and show images of people having a good time. That's why it's all over TV with commercials. It's showing people having good times at the restaurant or at the sports complex. So it's an effective way to advertise, but you have to be careful. You can do it, but make sure you keep showing a variety of people, right? And unfortunately, what I've noticed on some stock imagery websites where we get like stock music, stock photos and video, I think some of these stock imagery, most of them that I've seen, you really have to kind of keep looking hard to find a decent mix of diversity. They have a lot of white folks in their images, and you got to be conscious about that stuff. You want to make sure that you're not running ads where people are like, oh, so it's only for them, because that's the only thing I'm seeing in these ads you're running. You got to be careful. I would have expected better. I keep looking. I just, at the end of the day, if I can't find them, I don't show them. I just don't use that strategy. I just won't use pictures of people. So you want to make sure that if you do, that you're showing a diversity. It comes back to, on the test for you guys, knowing when these various categories were applied and enacted. So we want to make sure that you're familiar with the progression of these protected classes. When did they get put into the mix? It all started a couple of years after the Civil War. And so the very first fair housing, or not even fair housing, the very first protected class related laws went into effect, and they were about race, which should be pretty easy to remember because it's sort of attached to that whole Civil War era, right? So race was the first one. And it had basically said in the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1866, look, we can't discriminate on the basis of race with regard to any property, both real and personal. Obviously, a lot of people didn't adhere. It wasn't done right, but it was an official law on the books. No exemptions, no discrimination based on race for interactions with real property or personal property. So the first one that started it all was race on the tail of the Civil War. Fast forward about 100 years. Now we have a specific fair housing law put into effect. So the first one back then, right after the Civil War, that wasn't just housing. That was everything. Housing, real and personal property. Federal Civil Rights Act. Then the first four categories that were specifically related to the Federal Fair Housing Act, which happened in 1968. You got to know that too. It was in the 1968 era. Included race, color, nationality, and religion. If we think about it, let's see, race, color, and nationality. Let's look up at the big list. We've got race, color. Okay, so those are kind of related. That should be pretty easy to remember, right? Out of this whole list of 7, race, color, national origin, kind of a little similarity there. And then the fourth one being religion. So all of that, it was originally just 4 protected classes under federal fair housing laws. Notice this doesn't say state. We're not talking about state laws. We're talking about on the federal level. If we go another 10 years almost and get into the 70s, they added a 5th one into the mix, and the 5th one was sex. And I don't know how you are about history, but what I think of the mid-70s, I'm thinking about movies and TV from back then because I was around. Some of you weren't. But I'm thinking about like women's liberation movements. Like they had marches. That was a big thing that we see in movies about marches back then, and bra burning and things like that. The equal treatment for women. So that's how I remember that the fifth one that was added in the 70s was one about sex. Because back then it was strictly male-female when it came to sex. Now the way they've handled the last several years is we're going to add to the sex category to include gender identity, sexual orientation. So all that's kind of enveloped in together. We go into the next decade, the sixth fair housing category and the sixth and seventh were added. Disability and familial status were the most recent two. No discrimination against someone on the basis of their disability. No discrimination on whether they have underage kids. This disability thing, how could that apply? What if I showed a house, or I didn't show it, I previewed it. It's actually a model home in a neighborhood that's about to close out. And a builder named Niblock in Cabarrus County, they bought this land, and on the land there's a house built in 1883. And they spent a bunch of money and renovated it and restored it to its former glory. And they're asking $1.4 million for it. They've got it listed for sale. And the rest of the neighborhood is all around the $500,000 to $600,000 range. So I was just in a historic house today. If you owned a historic house and you wanted to rent it out, anybody ever been in an old house? What have you found about the old house with regard to sizes of door openings, for instance? Did you hit your head? Sometimes they're lower. Sometimes they're narrow. Well, are they so narrow that someone in a wheelchair couldn't get through it? If it's an old enough house, probably. This house today, since it had been completely renovated, and they use it as a model home, by the way, which means now it has to have access to the general public. They need to have easy access to it. They had proper ramps, proper widths of doors. In fact, the display of the progression of this history of the house was put up in one of the rooms and mounted on the old doors. They have 3 old doors, and they use them as sort of boards to show the story, probably because the old doors don't do them any good anymore because they had to widen the doorways, because they made this a model home that needs to have access to the public for ADA rules and laws. So if you own an old house and you want to rent it out, you got to be willing to adapt it to the needs of a disabled person who might want to rent it. Does that mean you have to pay for the doors to be widened? No. But you have to allow them to be widened. It would be at the tenant's expense. And you could negotiate with that tenant that once their time is up of renting it, their lease, they've got to pay to restore it to the way it was before they came in there. So that's allowable. But you might be thinking historic, like a house that's truly in the historic district. Do you really want to be taking a saw to it to comply? Well, then don't rent it. Then it's probably not something you should rent, because you would have to be willing to do that. The other thing that you see, obviously, is wheelchair ramps. They're not quite as intrusive, but it could be difficult or pretty big to have the proper angle. Might turn into half the front yard, depending on how it's laid out, but that would be a requirement if you're making it available for rent. So you need to stay on top of that and know these progressions, because they could ask you a question and say something like, when did it become illegal to refuse to sell to someone based on their gender? And it wasn't in the 60s. It was in the 70s. It was in 74 when sex was added to the fair housing categories. So know that these 4 was the start. This was the 5th. This was the 6th and 7th. Now that's for purchases. And rental. When it comes to finance, lenders have 3 more protected classes. If you're loaning money to somebody to buy a house, you can't refuse to loan them money because of their marital status. They should have equal chance to borrow the money regardless of their status when it comes to marriage. Also, you can't discriminate based on age. And I might have given you this example already. My friend in the business, her grandmother died at 105. Grandmother moved here from New York, I think at 96, and she bought a house. I think she paid cash, but if she had gotten a loan, they wouldn't have been able to say, you're 96 and you want a 30-year mortgage? How healthy are you? Are you going to be around in the 120 year of age? Irrelevant. Illegal. Can't discriminate with financing based on age, marital status, or turning somebody down because part of their income comes from public assistance. If they get some public assistance from the government, they still should have equal opportunity to qualify for that loan. So these are extra under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which adheres to lenders. So it's those 7 protected classes under Fred's Corn, these additional ones under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So you're going to need to be able to handle knowing where these different categories fall. If they say so-and-so was discriminated against based on their color, which of the following makes it illegal? Is it the Tenant Security Deposit Act? Is it the Equal Credit Opportunity Act? Is it the Federal Fair Housing Act? They'll give you a fourth. But out of those 3, which one is it that makes it illegal to discriminate against somebody based on their color? That's how they would ask it. So just be aware that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act is about marital status, age, and the receipt of public assistance. Fred's Corn is these 7. And let's see. Talked about the logo. Need to have that in there because if you don't post it, you could be deemed guilty of discrimination just by not posting it. And the ways that these fair housing laws are violated are these: refusing to sell or lease to somebody because they're in one of those classes. Last year, when I taught continuing education, an entire section where I think we ended up about 90 minutes worth of the 4 hours was about racial equity, which included a lot of fair housing violations. Case studies. Long Island, New York, there was like a big issue, recurring theme where a whole bunch of brokers up there were busted in a testing sting operation. Testing meaning people could call you. The Department of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, hires people to test us. So you could receive a phone call once you have your license and somebody could ask you very certain questions and they're posing as a client, a potential client, and you've got to know the laws enough to recognize, oh, wait, I can't answer those questions, and give the proper responses because they're literally testing to see if you know your fair housing laws. And if you fail, you could be in violation of federal and or state. And a lot of the Long Island realtors were busted because they were violating fair housing. They maybe thought they heard a certain class on the phone and treated them differently. And then when someone else called or they saw a picture or somehow they staged it so that they thought they were dealing with one protected class and compared it to a non-protected class, and did they treat the one differently than the other? And a lot of them failed that test. So if you call like an apartment complex and say, do you have anything available? And they were to say, sure, we've got some things available. Come on by and I'll show you. And then you show up and you're in a protected class. And then all of a sudden they don't know that you were the one who called, but they say, oh, I'm sorry, everything's leased. Nothing available. Clearly, right? That's what we're talking about. That kind of thing sadly happens still. Refusing to sell to somebody because of their fair housing category, or charging them more, a bigger down payment when it comes to a lender, a different interest rate, a higher interest rate because of their protected class that they're in. lying about something, saying they can't be there, saying something's sold, something's leased. When we're talking about this fair housing, this is housing, right? This is residential. We're talking about things designed for occupancy as a residence, not commercial. There are other things in place for commercial, but what the federal fair housing laws are about is housing, residences. And it's 1 to 4 units because that's still considered residential. If it were 5 or more units, that'd be considered commercial. That's just sort of across the board. We know this already. Familial status is about children under 18. Disability or handicapping condition means that some sort of a major life activity is being limited by their physical or mental situation. By the way, we had another section in CE a year or two ago about service animals versus assistance animals. It used to be that service animals weren't necessarily only dogs. Do you know what other kind of animal used to be allowable as a service animal? That'd probably not be a bad one. Somebody said pigs. Now, don't get it mixed up. There is a difference between a service animal and an assistance animal or an emotional assistance animal. We're talking about service animals. That's who the entity that oversees the application of service animal rules is ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. Emotional assistance animals are a bigger variety of species, but now service animals are only dogs. But it used to be you could also have a horse. A little miniature horse was a really good idea because, for one thing, you get more money, more animal for your buck, not in terms of weight, but lifespan. Horses last like 25 years or more. A friend of mine, her horse just died at 31. That was a full-size horse, but people liked the horses. They'd put little rubber boots on them to protect the wood floors, and there they are, this little tiny horse. And they'd get 25 years out of it instead of the normal like 10, 12 years of a dog. But now that's off the table. Service animals can only be dogs now. There you go. That's a good idea. Somebody said an elephant lasts forever. A tortoise. If you're not in any particular hurry, you could get a giant tortoise. They last like 100 years. You'd need 100 years for them to get you there, probably. Oh, here's the other thing about disability. A drug addict. A drug abuser versus a drug addict. Do you want to rent to a drug addict? What if they just got out of rehab or were in rehab? Then it becomes a disability and you can't turn them down because of the rehab. If there's no rehab, then yes, you can turn them down. But if they're in rehabilitation, then no, can't turn them down over the drug situation. Here's our ADA. As a landlord, if you decide to rent out that property, ADA says, well, then you have to allow it to be modified to accommodate people with disabilities. It's more than just widths of doors. If somebody is confined to a wheelchair, or if they're a little person, they might request and need the counters to be lowered. How many counters are in your kitchen? And you're going to rent that property and they all need to be replaced with something like a foot or two lower. If you're going to rent it and somebody who needs them lowered decides to apply and has no other reason for you to turn them down, then you got to be willing to have them lowered. Now, again, you could build into the lease that they're going to pay to restore it back to normal height once their lease expires and they're out of there. But the landlord has to allow for reasonable modifications. They can't increase the security deposit over it, but they can negotiate a restoration agreement. And it's the tenant who's got to pay for the changes. It could also be this. Maybe it's a property that's like impossible to make modifications to. I believe it was in Cary. I've heard another instructor's material, and he said The post office, or one post office in Cary, has like 20 stone steps. The building it's in is pretty much impossible to build a wheelchair ramp up to. And so if somebody wants a P.O. box in that post office, instead of adapting the structure, they've adapted the process. So a person with a disability can pull up to a certain parking space and basically honk the horn or maybe text or something, and a postal worker will come out, get their key, empty their box, and bring it out to them. So they've adapted the procedure since they couldn't adapt the structure. So modification versus adaptation. There are some exemptions to federal fair housing laws, or just fair housing laws, could be state. And we'll talk about those after break. But yes, this means that people can discriminate against the protected classes in these situations. I'll see you back in 10 minutes. Welcome back. Let's talk about some exemptions. Now, this is where they can test you, and you're going to need to be aware. Are they talking about a national fair housing law or a state fair housing law exemption? A national exemption or a state exemption, that's a better way to say it. They're different, potentially. So, exemptions to federal fair housing laws. Can you refuse to sell your house to somebody in a protected class just because they're in that class, because of their race, color, religion, disability, sex, color, religion, disability, sex. Now I just blanked. Help me. What's the rest of Fred's corn? Thank you. Familial status. National origin. Can you discriminate because somebody's in one of those groups when it comes to selling your own house? Nationally, yes, you can. National exemptions to fair housing laws say someone selling their own house or leasing their own house for sale by owner for lease by owner can choose not to sell or lease to a person because they're in one of those 7 classes. To our credit as North Carolina, we've said, nope, we're not going along with that. We're not giving that exemption. So for us in this room doing real estate in North Carolina, it's irrelevant because every property we sell in North Carolina, guess what, is located in North Carolina. So North Carolina does not allow that exemption. Be proud of your state, right? Glad for the state. Good job, North Carolina. Now, if the test says an owner in another state that's not North Carolina chooses to not sell to someone because they are from India, is this illegal? Then the answer is no. There's an exemption allowable for that, right? Because the national exemption allows for it. State exemption does not. If it's in North Carolina, is it illegal? Yes, because that is not an allowable exemption in North Carolina. Now, what if it's a multifamily property, like a duplex, a triplex, a quadplex, 2, 3, or 4? The national exemption says that if the owner occupies one of those units, then yes, they can choose to not rent to someone in those other units if they themselves are the owner living in one of those other units. North Carolina didn't do as well this time. North Carolina said, okay, well, if it's either an owner living in one of those duplex, triplex, quadplex units or a relative of the owner in either of those cases, then yes, you can choose not to rent to someone for those other units based on those protected classes. So North Carolina exemption, even worse, right? Even more, a little more widespread. Could be the owner or relative of the owner living there. And yes, then they could choose to discriminate, essentially. The last North Carolina one on the right says that we can still have basically dorms that are same sex. We can still say this is a dorm only for women, only for men. Student housing is still exempt from fair housing laws. You're not forced to have both. And then on the national level, exemptions include you could have a private club that says only people who are in this particular group can be a part of this club. And religious organizations. You could say this is an organization for Baptists only. If you're not Baptist, you can't be in this organization. However, for both the private group and the religious organization, it's got to just be for that particular class. It can't be for anything else. In other words, that Baptist organization can't say, well, no disabled people allowed because we're a religious organization and so we can discriminate against any of the classes. That's not the way it works. They can only discriminate against the religious class in that case. Only people of that religion can be in that organization. That's the only one of the 7 categories that they can discriminate against with regard to these exemptions. So the main thing is keeping track, are we talking about a national exemption or a state exemption? Don't let them twist you around on the test over those things. We'll see some examples in a minute. We talked about age when it came to the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Let's look at Fred's corn again. Do we see age anywhere? There's no A in Fred's corn. What about, anybody thought about this yet? Have you seen these neighborhoods? I looked at one today. There's a new one in Cabarrus County that's 55 plus. Anybody heard of a 55 and older or 62 and older kind of neighborhood? It's legal. It's allowed. And even though age is not a part of Fred's corn, familial status is. And one of the provisions of these 55 and older type communities is no underage children allowed. If it's a married couple, one of them has to be 55 and older. The other one can be younger, as long as one of them is. And the point here is people in that age category want to have an option to not have what goes along with a neighborhood full of kids. They don't want the noise, maybe. They don't want the toys. They don't want all the stuff that goes with that. And they are allowed under an exemption to fair housing laws to not comply with familial status. The reason, have you ever noticed they're always new? It's always something that is this way from the beginning. And that's because you can't run somebody out. So let's say it's an old neighborhood of like 100 houses. And because of maybe the fact that all the houses are on one level, they all have convenient sidewalks and they all have maybe pool and close to things that seniors might want to be near. There's a couple neighborhoods in downtown Concord like that. They've both they're not officially 55 and older, but 55 and older really like those because of all those features they have. Well, what if there's one more house, that 100th house, that has a couple who are in their 40s and they finally sell and somebody 55 plus ends up buying it. And now for this small moment in time, everybody living in there is 55 and older. They could, if they wanted to, and they could pass the vote and everybody voted to do this, decide from here forward, let's make this community 55 plus. They wouldn't have been able to do it while someone was under that age and run someone out, but that's impossible. That's probably never going to happen, but that's why they're always new, because from get-go, they can establish that as the primary selling feature. It tends to be more pricey. Those houses tend to be, minimum. I think I've seen, and this was 5 years ago up in Salisbury, there was one in the 350 to 4 range, but they're almost always 500-600 plus. And then more commonly, they're almost always $250 plus per month for homeowners association, because a big part of what they want that to live in that community for is the amenities, right? The clubhouse, the pool, the things that come along with that for their active lifestyle. So it could be either of these, 55 older, 62 and older, but they are exempt from the whole can't turn down somebody with underage kids. There's usually rules in place that'll say, yes, your relatives can visit, even the ones under 18, but for a limited time. They can't actually be living there with you. So different ones have different rules about how long somebody that doesn't fall into the age bracket can actually stay there or live there. It's pretty much for visitation only. If somebody's violating a state fair housing law, who do we complain to? We would complain to the North Carolina Human Relations Council. That's who would take the complaint related to a state violation. If it's a violation of federal fair housing, it would be a department under HUD called Office of Equal Opportunity, OEO at HUD. So maybe if one of those exemptions was violated, these are the two entities that you would complain to, either or both, maybe both, because easily most of these violations are in fact violations of both. All right, some terms, some definitions. I bet you know some of these already. Let me paint a scenario. Little old lady who came from Spain. She says, hey, you're an agent here in Cary, Raleigh area. What neighborhood has a bunch of Spanish people in it? People like me from Spain. Can you take me there? If you comply with that, if you drive them straight over to that neighborhood that meets those requirements that she has based on classes, race, color, religion, national origin, disability, familial status, sex, what are you guilty of? What is it called when you drive them over to the place that has those protected classes? Either drive them toward it because they ask you for that, or drive them away from it because they don't want to live near those groups of people. What is it called when you do that? This one is probably the easiest of the three terms I'm about to show you to remember. What are you doing when you're driving them there? Physically, the act of driving to get from this street to that street. The name of that verb, there it is. So steering is what it's called when you are intimidating or trying to influence a buyer by violating fair housing. You're either saying, no, you don't want to live over there, that's where they live. Or you're saying, yes, you want to live over there because that's where people like you live. Either case, it's steering. Steering is about buyers. It's about misbehaving with regard to buyers and driving them or directing them toward or away of an area because of protected classes. When it comes to selling, that's called block busting. If you go on a listing appointment and say, oh, seller, so-and-so, there's a lot of people from this other protected class moving in here. You better hurry up and sell before they take over. That's block busting. You're busting up the block. You're trying to influence a seller based on fear through fair housing classes. And that's what we mean by block busting. So block busting is about sellers. Steering is about buyers. Redlining is about lenders. Lenders being big jerks and violating protected classes. It comes back from the idea of putting a map up on the wall and drawing a red border around the parts of town where a certain group of people live and saying, we don't want to make loans over on this side of the tracks over here because that's predominantly this protected class. That's redlining. And people still get busted for that. There's still some modern day cases, probably all of them, I'm sure. Yeah, Marcus, I'm thinking the same thing. It was relatively recently a redlining issue in North Carolina. So it's about lenders not giving loans because this area of town has this type of person. Where does all this show itself? Well, certainly advertising. We talked about imagery, also language. That's a big one because it's one of those where certainly an agent could be completely stupid, and gosh, North Carolina does such a good job of making this point that you'd have to just be belligerent to screw this up as a broker. But I think most of the times that a broker screws this up is when they get too caught up in trying to describe the property in terms of the people that might want to enjoy it. And they don't focus on the property's benefits. They focus more on the people that might want to be there. So a classic violation would be in Charlotte, easy walking distance to the Jewish community center. Well, you maybe got a couple there. You said walking distance. Even if it said a block or two away from the Jewish community center, that'd be a major religious violation. You could call it just the community center, but don't say something to imply that, yeah, attention Jewish people, this one's for you. It's essentially that. That's the concept, right? So It could also be even the YMCA, close to the YMCA, because that stands for Young Men's Christian Association. You've got to just be careful. You don't want to make people think that because they're a part of a group that's protected that they're not allowed or invited. So it's the language and it's the imagery too. We'll see some words in just a second. Also denying membership in groups, brokerage groups like firms or the Realtor Association or certain designations based on fair housing categories. And then also this another one that people have been, I saw something about this pop up recently. Appraisers accused of giving lower values because of where it was, the people living there versus the sales comps. So that appraisal needs to be based on what sales prices were or are for that particular neighborhood. They shouldn't make an adjustment because a protected class predominantly lives there. That's all. Those are all the most common ways that this stuff gets done wrong. Here's the language. Certainly acceptable would be something like good neighborhood. Not acceptable would be no French, no certain class. Acceptable would be bachelor apartment. Not acceptable would be female only. Walk to shopping is actually okay. Able-bodied tenants only would not be okay. Family room is okay, but adults only is not okay because of familial. In our multiple listing service here in Charlotte, they just made an adjustment, and we don't call it a master bedroom anymore. We call it a primary bedroom in the system. And I noticed on those new construction houses I showed or looked at today that they call it a main bedroom. So it's constantly evolving. We're just trying to make sure that we have inclusion and nobody feels left out. So who's responsible for that ad that you're running? Which could be, and I did this during a break a couple hours ago in this class, I got a little bit of footage I filmed driving through the street of one of those new construction, and I just clipped it real quick and posted it to Instagram. Easy as that, because I know my broker in charge. I'm pretty tight with him. I knew that he was cool with it because all I did was post the drive-through and wrote, hey, if you want to buy something new, let me know. Who's responsible for the ads that you run, the language that you use, the images that you use in your ads? No people showed up in my little video clip, by the way. And you got it, your broker in charge. So your firm should have a policy and procedures manual that has provisions in place. Here's how we want you to do this. I taught a BIC up last week. So I had 60 BICs in the room, and I'm like, what's your policy and procedures for running ads? And some of them said, we teach classes on it. We also make them, some other ones said they got to run it by me first. Bless their heart. Good grief. Can you imagine? But hey, it's your license on the line. Make sure that you do it right. If you're the one on the hook, you make your rule and make sure it gets handled right. Maybe it's for the provisionals until they get used to it. And then the non-provisionals, unless they have some issue, they're okay. We're going to trust them. But it might be that it needs to be approved. It's up to them. It's up to the firm, up to the BIC. But if you violate it, you've got major issues. Remember those exemptions. We have this exemption even in North Carolina that if you live in one side of the duplex as the owner of the duplex, then you can choose not to rent to somebody for the other half because of one of the protected classes they might be in. You can still discriminate. In other words, what if you're a broker? Yes, you're the owner of that building, but you're also a real estate broker with a license. Now, do you have that same exemption? And the answer is no. You don't have any exemptions. Because you're going to have your license, we are held to a higher standard. We don't have the same exemptions that a non-licensee does. Even though they could do it, we can't because we know better. Because we've decided to be brokers and have a real estate license. Therefore, there are no exemptions for anybody with a broker's license ever, even in your personal transactions. It's a violation, could go all the way back to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but because you have a broker's license. And they like to do that. They'll paint a little paragraph picture for you and they'll say this and this and this and this and this, and they did this. And you're like, well, typically that'd be an exemption, and they have a broker's license. Oh, then it's all off the table. No exemption for you. Not allowed because you have a broker's license. It's sort of like disclosure. Remember how if you're selling your own house, on that disclosure statement, if you're a broker, you can't hide behind no representation. If you know the roof leaks and you're a broker owner of that house, then you have to admit that the roof leaks. If you didn't have the real estate license, then you could just check no representation and not say one way or the other. But you don't have the same privilege when you're a broker, when it comes to disclosure and when it comes to fair housing. Here's one that I should probably do some research to see why this is here, because it just seems so unnecessary. Clearly it is necessary. It wouldn't be here, but guess what? It's not allowed to sexually harass your tenants by the landlord or by the brokers they hire. Okay, good to know. I thought that was illegal across the board, but it's in here, so don't do it, guys. I know you were about to. I could tell. No verbal harassment, no nonverbal harassment, no physical harassment. All not allowed by either landlords or their broker agents. ADA applies to employment. When you have a certain, there it is, firms of 15 or more employees, got to have accessibility requirements in place, got to be able to get to the bathroom, get through the doors if they're disabled, for instance. It also applies to sales, purchases, and leases of commercial facilities. So it applies to firms when it's all of these things. They've got to comply because they've got employees and also because they're open to the public. Places of public accommodation. Talked about this one already. I think when we look in the agency agreement, it's got more than 7 protected classes mentioned in the paragraph. Let me see if I can pull it up. Even though I told you that it's built into the category of sex, that there is no discrimination against gender identity or sexual orientation, it goes further than that. Oh my goodness. What's happening? It's weird. It's forcing me to do the share thing again. Sorry, guys. I'm trying to pull up a contract, but it won't let me. It's doing that weird thing. But I'll show you that paragraph another time. It says in the paragraph the 7 classes, but it also at the tail end says also no discrimination against sexual orientation and gender identity. That's because the North Carolina Association of Realtors is who created these documents. And so they added that into the Realtor Code of Ethics. No discrimination about those things either. And then the 7 classes do still also have that factored in because we're told that sex includes those now. All right, let's do a little pop quiz here. Failure to comply with fair housing laws is both a civil and criminal violation, in addition to being grounds for disciplinary action with the Real Estate Commission. True or false? Civil, criminal, disciplinary, all 3. True or false? Put that in the chat for me. It is true. We could be, and plus the client could be guilty of their agent's actions too. So clients need to know they should hire a good agent, an agent who knows these laws and rules. And there's a lot of agents that don't. So yeah, you could end up with both civil and criminal and disciplinary action. A licensee who works in an area with few minorities shouldn't worry because they won't normally have a problem with complying with fair housing laws. True or false? Shouldn't worry because they won't have to won't have a problem. There's not very many people against whom to be violating. Yeah, that's not good enough, is it? They even could have more of a problem because they don't have enough practice, right? There are less occurrences to keep them sharp, keep them aware of compliance issues. What about this one? HUD testers, housing and urban development tester people who make calls and see if you know what you're doing. They need to answer truthfully if you ask them, are you a tester? Sort of like on TV when you watch cop shows and they ask, are you a cop? You have to tell me. I don't even know if that's true or not. But that's not true here either. It might be true with the cops, but it's not true with testers. It would kind of defeat the purpose of testing. So nope, not true. They don't have to tell. They are paid to be liars. A real estate licensee cannot be held liable for the discriminatory actions of the owner. The licensee has to follow all orders of the client, so they are not guilty if they have to follow all the orders. Is it true that we have to follow all the orders of the client? What's the little nuance to that? We don't follow their every directive. We follow their legal directives. That would be an unlawful, illegal directive if they told us to violate fair housing or discriminatory. We're considered one with our client. Agent and principal are one. Either are guilty of the other. And so it's important for an agent to work with clients that they're not going to have to worry about this with. And don't. Walk away if you figure out that they're not going to comply. And the same for the client. We need to follow all lawful orders, not just every order. A BIC could be liable for an agent's actions even if the broker was unaware of the discriminatory event. Broker in charge could be liable for the agent's actions even if the broker was unaware of the discriminatory event. Put some pressure on that BIC. They're the head of the firm. They're liable for all actions of licensees, especially with regard to fair housing. Make sure you have policies to make sure everybody's trained, well trained on what not to do. Housing providers can charge families with children more of a security deposit because there's more chance of damage and more wear and tear. True or false? Easy one. Easy false. The house next door is a group home for mentally challenged teenagers. This is a material fact and must be disclosed. True or false? Mentally challenged teenagers. Have to disclose it? No, it's a protected class under handicap, under disability. Good job. Not presenting an offer from a minority is okay if there's already a pending contract on the listing. Violation of both fair housing laws and real estate license law because you have to present all offers. You violated fair or license law with that one, plus the fact that they were a minority. Housing provider must act with discriminatory intent before he can be held liable under the Fair Housing Act. True or false? Is it about your intention? It's not about the intention, is it? Your intentions are relevant if the actions are perceived by a protected class to be discriminatory. Intent is irrelevant. Local or state laws that conflict with federal fair housing laws take precedence. If they conflict with state, they take precedence. True or false? Which one always wins? We've seen that. Federal, state, local. Which law always wins? We saw it with permits. We saw it with zoning. And it's still the case here. You got it. The stricter one takes precedence. Doesn't matter which one is the stricter one. For sale by owners are not governed by federal or North Carolina fair housing laws. They may discriminate as long as a broker is not involved. True or false? You got it. Yep. They kind of lumped that in there real sly, but you caught it. So North Carolina laws don't allow for sale by owners to discriminate. Federal laws do. And since the question had them both in there together, then the answer is false. If it had split them up, you'd have needed to know, oh, if it was just federal, then yes, they can discriminate. If it was just North Carolina, then no, they can't. Licensees who were charged with violating fair housing laws may be found guilty if they failed to prove that they did not discriminate. Are you innocent until proven guilty? In other words, not when it comes to fair housing laws. You are guilty until proven innocent. You got to prove that you didn't do it. What if someone asks you this question? Can you tell me how many people of this protected class live in this neighborhood? Race, color, religion, familial status, disability, national origin, sex. If you were to give a longer answer than no, what might be a way that you could answer this question? It's a good one. Not at liberty to disclose. Not authorized to say. Okay. Violation of fair housing. I hear ya. Federal and state fair housing laws prohibit me from discussing that with you. Any version of any of that still works. Good job. What about this one? Can you refuse to work with someone for reasons other than those covered by fair housing laws? Does Fred's corn include the category of big jerk? If somebody's a jerk, difficult, jerks are not a protected class. That needs to be a t-shirt. I should sell that t-shirt. Jerks are not a protected class. Yeah, correct. There's no protected class. You can choose not to work with people as long as it's not because of the fair housing categories. And it's good to listen to the inner voice. If you kind of get a feel somebody's kind of jerking you around or they're going to be difficult or unreasonable, it's okay to just walk away. Even better than that, though, is to say, you know what? I think I got the perfect fit for you. Let me refer you to my least favorite broker in the business and charge them a referral fee so they can deal with your butt. And then when you do finally buy something, they'll have to pay me a referral fee. That's the best solution, right? But at least walking away will save you some heartache. Go work with people that love you and appreciate you. Okay. My goodness. We've got all kinds of weird things happening. Okay, that finally went away. Good. What's next? Let's see. Taxation or construction. We'll talk about one or the other. Let's talk about construction. That's a little bit less dry for such a late hour as this. Oh my goodness. It may not let me. What the heck? Sorry, bear with me. Oh wow. This has never happened before. Sorry, guys. We're almost done. Then we will wing it. We'll come back to construction next week, but before that, since I got something working, let's pick up where we left off with this comment section for another couple minutes, and then we'll call it. And I'll figure out why I'm being forced to share. Okay. Some general brokerage provisions in your comments section. So we know that we got to have listing agreements in writing, but oral buyer agency is okay for an amount of time, not longer than it takes to write an offer. Got to turn it to writing at time of writing an offer. We talked about that first substantial contact concept. What is first substantial contact? What am I talking about there? This idea of when we have to start telling them what their options are for working with us, who we might work for, how they might hire us. At what point do we have to have the conversation? There we go. That's probably a little closer to it. That last one Holly mentioned. We're talking about, it's not just initial, right? So I went up to a house today. I was going to get a video of it to put on the YouTube channel, and a person was there. A lady was there, and I thought, oh no, I'm in a hurry, and now I got to wait for this agent to show this house so that I can get in there and make a video. And so I thought, well, let me go ahead and see if there's no one else here. Maybe her client is still not there yet. Maybe I could get through it in a couple of minutes real fast with my phone and make a quick video. But she said, are you with the builder? And I'm like, no. Are you an agent? And she said, no. She said, I just want to see the house. I'm like, oh, cool. Maybe a client. Did I need to tell her about working with agents disclosure in that moment? All she said was, I want to see the house. She didn't tell me how much she qualified for, if she was paying cash. She didn't tell me she had to be in it by November or anything like that. No, that was not this thing called first substantial contact, right? That's what that is. First substantial contact would have been, what if she said, oh, wow, I really need to buy something by next month, and I qualify for $530,000. Well, yeah, okay, brakes, put the brakes on. Lady, let me tell you some stuff real quick before you go further. If she surprise attacked me with that type of information, I'd need to stop and say, let me share with you how this whole agency thing works. Don't tell me anything you wouldn't want the seller to know, because right now I'm not your agent. I would love to be so. Hire me, please, but you haven't yet. Therefore, fair warning. Sometimes first initial contact is when we need to tell who we're working for, though. In the case where, for instance, if I had scheduled to show a house to my buyer and I got there first and the buyer wasn't there yet and the seller was getting the family loaded up in the minivan, and so I'm right there, I have to introduce myself. They haven't told me anything. It's the seller. They're just trying to get out of my way so I can show the house as per the schedule. And so in that moment, I am in first initial contact with that seller, in which case I would need to say, yeah, I'm the buyer agent. I'm going to be showing it. They're not here yet. So that's when I would explain nothing. I would just disclose. I'm not explaining agency to them. I'm just disclosing who I represent. And you have to do that at first initial contact when you're talking to either the seller or their listing agent, right? It's sort of built into the offer paperwork, by the way. When you write an offer to purchase and contract, on like second to last page, you check the box to disclose what your role is. Are you a buyer agent or a sub-agent, or a dual agent or a designated agent? But this first substantial contact idea That's a big deal. And it's all about making sure they know what their choices are. Their choices depend on who? Whatever you make available to them. Because they can't just pick something that you don't agree with. If they say, I want you to be a dual agent, can you say to them, I don't want to do that? Are you allowed to not offer dual agency to them? Sure. And every CE class, I ask that question, either because your firm won't let you or because you don't want to. Who here does not do dual agency? And at least half of them, if not 80%, say, nope, don't want to do it, not interested. Probably because they had a bad situation. And probably that involved somebody, one of the parties, thinking that the agent was showing preferential treatment to the other party. It's really hard to not make them both feel that way, one or the other. They're kind of guarded. So it's not for everybody. I'll do it, but it's case by case. I've got to feel pretty good about both parties being cool about such things. And I'd rather not. And most people do answer at least that way. I'd rather not. So first substantial contact, money and motivation. Now we go into, all right, guys, well, here are your choices. I don't do dual agency. I don't do designated agency. That's what this is. So I'm not willing to do that. But if you want me to be your buyer agent, we can do that. I can show you the house. I can write up the offer. I can show you other houses for sale. The seller has their own agent that they've already hired. If you don't have your own buyer agent and you just go deal with the listing agent, guess what? They are not going to be your only buyer, your agent all to yourself. At the very least, your choices working with a listing agent are going to be that they act as a dual agent for both you and the seller. And here's what that means. Or you could just not have an agent, in which case you're kind of up against somebody who's a professional in the business and you're someone who doesn't have a license. Maybe you can pull that off. Maybe you can't, but why should you have to try? I'm here to help you. And I'm usually okay with how much the seller's willing to pay me. The seller would pay a commission to their agent, and that agent will share it with me. If it's something that's too low, and you can get into as deep as that as you want to at this point, but you may not want to get too deep into it. But point is, I checked today. By the way, I was thinking this person doesn't have an agent. What kind of wiggle room do I have in the event of something crazy? Would I even maybe offer her a rebate? Could I offer her a buyer rebate? If I act as a buyer agent to entice her to let me be her buyer agent, could I share some of my commission with her? Tell me in the chat. Yeah, she's a party to the transaction. Some people would say no because she doesn't have a license, but it's not about that. True that you can't share your commission with someone without a license. You can't pay a referral fee to somebody that doesn't have a license, but she is not just an unlicensed person. She's a party to the transaction, in which case I can give her money. I could give the seller money if I wanted to. License doesn't matter in that situation. So it's explaining how all this stuff works is what's triggered by this first substantial contact thing. Let's see here.